The Force is light and full of shadows.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The rain had been falling for 6 hours. Anakin Skywalker had not noticed until this moment, standing 3 meters from the window, with his blue blade still lit and his arms still shaking, noticing the way the water moved in rivulets down the transparisteel, and thinking distantly that the lights of the city below looked like a second sky turned upside down. He was still processing what he had done, what he had chosen not to do. Mace Windu stood at the window's edge, with his purple blade pressed flat against Palpatine's throat. And Palpatine was not fighting anymore. He had stopped fighting the moment Anakin had stepped forward and taken the blade from his own hand. Not Windu's, not Palpatine's, his own. He had disarmed himself, removed his own capacity to make the wrong choice, before he could make it. Padmé, he had thought. Just her name, sitting in the center of his chest like a stone. Padmé and the children I haven't met yet, and the life I haven't built yet. He had said to Windu, "Take him, arrest him. This is the right way." And Windu had looked at him, really looked, the way a general looks at a soldier he didn't expect to hold the line, and given one short nod. The room smelled of ozone and fear. Palpatine's face was ruined. His own lightning had come back to him when Windu's blade deflected it. And the man who had been Chancellor for 13 years, who had smiled at Anakin across 1,000 private dinners, was now something older and stranger and worse. The face beneath the face, yellow where eyes should be. Anakin looked at that face and felt nothing but tired. Obi-Wan Kenobi was not supposed to be here. He crossed the threshold with his hands loose at his sides and his hood pushed back, still wearing the dust and dried blood of Utapau on his robes. He had come alone. The Force had pulled at him since Grievous fell. A wrongness, a shift in the deep current of things, the sensation of a tide reversing direction, and he had followed it because Obi-Wan had spent 20 years following things he couldn't name and calling it duty. He stopped. He read the room the way only a man who had survived 100 impossible situations could read it. 3 dead royal guards on the marble floor, positioned defensively around the desk, which meant Palpatine had been expecting this. Windu at the window with his blade up, and the Chancellor trapped beneath it. Anakin to the side, disarmed by choice, hands empty, looking at Obi-Wan with an expression that contained something Obi-Wan had never seen on his Padawan's face before. Relief, perhaps. Or the beginning of it. "Master," Anakin said, and the word sounded like it had traveled a long distance to reach him. Obi-Wan looked at Windu. He looked at Palpatine. He looked at the arc of lightning still scorched into the window's edge, at the upturned furniture, at the precise geometry of the violence. He read it all in 2 seconds and said quietly, "What happened?" "He's Sith," Windu said, without removing his eyes from Palpatine. "He has been for decades. This ends now." Palpatine did not look at Windu. He looked at Obi-Wan. The calculation was visible, if you knew how to see it, the wounded eyes moving past Anakin entirely, past the blade at his throat, fixing on the one man in the room who had not yet taken a side, who had walked in still open, who was still, in this first moment, only a Jedi Master standing in a ruined office trying to understand what he was looking at. When Palpatine spoke, his voice had changed. The groveling was gone. The theater of a cornered man was gone. What replaced it was quieter, and far more dangerous. "Obi-Wan," he said, "thank the Force you are here." They would not listen to reason. A pause. "You always listen to reason." Obi-Wan's eyes narrowed by a fraction. "Don't," Anakin said, stepping forward. "Master, don't listen to..." And then Palpatine stopped speaking entirely. What happened next was not a speech. It was not an argument. Anakin felt it before he understood it. A shift in the Force. A pressure like the atmosphere of the room had changed, like something was being poured from one vessel into another. He watched Obi-Wan's face go very still. He watched his master's hands, which had been loose and ready, slowly close at his sides. "Master," louder now. "Obi-Wan..." But Obi-Wan was somewhere else. The future is not one thing. He knows this. He has always known this. But it is. Anakin. Not now, not this Anakin standing in this office with his empty hands and his steady eyes. But later, years from now. A version of later that feels so true it hurts behind his teeth. He sees what he has always feared most, what he has suppressed every morning of the last 7 years, because suppression was what the code required, and the code was all that was keeping him functional. The temple, burning. But not because of this, not because of Palpatine, because of Anakin, loved and free and unguarded, because of Anakin's grief finally cracking through every wall that Obi-Wan spent a decade trying to build around it, because passion without anchor becomes catastrophe, because the boy who nearly wept over a dying Tusken Raider in the desert eventually becomes the voice beneath the vision, very quiet, like something heard through water. You know this. You have always known this. Every time he reached for darkness, you pulled him back. What happens when you are not there? What happens when no one is? Satine, Qui-Gon on the floor of the reactor room, already leaving, already becoming the Force, his last words not comfort but instruction. Promise me, promise me, promise me. The faces of 600 clone troopers who called him general and are now dust. Every person in that chain of losses died because of detachment, because no one was willing to act absolutely. He reaches for the code. It is still there, but it feels for the first time like something used up, like a bandage worn too long. You could end this, not with rage, with precision, with Ducelin, with duty. Mace Windu had been reading the room. He had been watching Palpatine's concentration, the particular quality of stillness that meant the Sith Lord was doing something invisible and catastrophic. He had watched Obi-Wan's face go blank and his breathing slow and his hands stop moving. He made his decision the way he always made decisions, absolutely immediately, with no space for doubt. It ends now, Windu said. He brought his blade down. Obi-Wan moved. Not quickly. That was the wrong word. He moved cleanly, the way a locked mechanism moves when the right key turns. His lightsaber came off his belt and ignited in a single practiced gesture, and the blue blade met Windu's purple one in the Soresu parry that Obi-Wan had executed 10,000 times in 20 years of war. The flat deflecting rotation that sent the strike wide without effort, without anger, without anything in his expression, except a terrible, wrecked calm. Windu stumbled back, stunned. He recovered fast. He was Mace Windu, fastest blade on the Council, and came back with Vaapad already moving, already drawing on the darkness in the room. But the darkness in the room now included Obi-Wan, and Soresu was the one form in the galaxy that Vaapad's feedback principle could not devour. Aggression fed Vaapad. Defense starved it. Every strike Windu threw, Obi-Wan turned. Every combination, absorbed. He gave no ground because Soresu needed no ground. He was a wall, and you cannot break a wall by hitting it harder. Anakin screamed something. He was running. He was too far. The tears started on Obi-Wan's face at some point during the duel. Anakin would not be able to say exactly when, afterward. He had simply looked up and seen them there, moving down his master's face while his blade moved with mechanical precision, while his feet stayed planted and his guard never opened. The most composed man Anakin had ever known, weeping and killing at the same time. And the combination was so wrong, it felt like seeing a fundamental law of nature break. "I am sorry, Master Windu," Obi-Wan said, his voice absolutely steady. "This is the only way to preserve what we built." Windu's Vaapad failed, not because he weakened, because his opponent gave him nothing to work with. Mace Windu fell. Anakin was at Windu's side before he had decided to move. He had Windu's hand in both of his, and he was looking up at Obi-Wan with something that had no name. Not betrayal, not hatred, something simpler and more devastating than either. The particular expression of a person watching the most certain thing in their world rearrange itself into something unrecognizable. "Master," his voice came out wrong. "What did you... Why did you?" Obi-Wan looked at him. The yellow had not come. Not fully. His eyes were still the gray-blue of the man Anakin knew, but something had retreated behind them. Something that used to stand at the front. "Go home to your wife, Anakin," he said quietly. "You should not have to see what comes next." He turned away. He turned to Palpatine. Palpatine, who had not moved from the window, who had watched the entire duel with an expression of pure and terrible patience, rose from his crouch with the careful dignity of a man who has never truly been in danger. He studied Obi-Wan the way a craftsman studies a piece of work that has finally met his standard. Obi-Wan did not kneel. He did not bow his head. He stood with his hands at his sides, and his blade extinguished and his face wet with tears that had already stopped falling. His body had done what it needed to do, and now it was done, sealed, finished, and he accepted the name that Palpatine spoke as he would have accepted any assignment, without ceremony, without spectacle, with only the silence of a man who has made a decision and will not unmake it. Darth Imperius. The Latin root lived in it. Imperium, the absolute authority to command, the right to govern, to compel, to order the world according to one's will. Obi-Wan let it settle on him like a new set of robes. He breathed in through his nose. He breathed out. The rain continued against the window. The city lights moved below them, indifferent, eternal. Somewhere in the building's ambient communication system, barely audible beneath the ventilation and the rain and the residual hum of extinguished blades, clone commanders across the galaxy were receiving a signal. Anakin heard it, a fraction of a second too late to mean anything. He looked down at Mace Windu's still hand in his. He looked at the marble floor. He looked at the space where his master had been standing, which now contained something else. He breathed. He chose, in that moment, the thing he would choose again and again in the months that followed, the thing that would define him more completely than any battle or prophecy or act of violence. He chose not to break. He set Windu's hand down gently. He stood. He turned away from Palpatine. He walked toward the door. Behind him, he heard Obi-Wan speak. Not to him, to Palpatine, in that new voice. The steady one, the one that had no warmth in it, but no cruelty either. Simply direction, beginning to outline the structure of what would come next. The logistics of it, the architecture, the negotiator negotiating the terms of a new world. Anakin did not look back. The 501st marched in silence. No drums, no commands called across ranks, just the rhythmic percussion of armored boots against Coruscant's paving stones. 600 identical men moving in unison through streets that had already begun to empty. Civilians pulling back from windows, speeder traffic thinning, the city developing that specific held-breath quality it got before something irreversible happened to it. Obi-Wan walked at their head, with his hands clasped behind his back. He was not marching, he was walking. The distinction mattered, though he could not have explained why. Marching was for soldiers going to a battle. He was not going to a battle. He was going to perform a surgery on something that had been failing for a very long time. And surgery required stillness, required the same quality of calm he had brought to every negotiation, every siege, every conversation on the edge of catastrophe across 20 years of a war that was now effectively over. The temple spires rose ahead of him, against a sky gone orange from the city's ambient glow. He had looked at those spires 10,000 times in his life. He had looked at them as a child arriving for the first time, his small hand in a temple guide's grip, tilting his head back because the towers seemed to go all the way to the stars. He had looked at them returning from campaigns, when every muscle ached and the force felt scraped clean inside him. He had looked at them the morning after Qui-Gon died, and understood, for the first time, what it meant to have no one left who truly knew him. He looked at them now and felt nothing unusual. That was perhaps the most frightening thing he could have reported, if there had been anyone to report it to. Behind him, the clone troopers followed. Across the city 3 kilometers east and 12 levels up, Anakin Skywalker stood on a landing pad with both hands pressed flat against a railing and his eyes closed and his breathing completely wrong. He had not gone home. He had told himself he was going home. He had walked out of the Senate building and into the air, and kept walking in the wrong direction, because some part of him, the part that had spent 10 years learning to read the Force the way other people read weather, had felt something happening that he needed to locate before he could name it. He found it now. The bond between him and Obi-Wan had existed since he was 9 years old, woven into his Force sense so thoroughly that for a long time he had not been able to tell where his own perception ended and his master's began. He knew Obi-Wan's presence the way he knew his own heartbeat. What he felt now was his heartbeat, but wrong. Recognizably his, undeniably his, but transposed, a half step off, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. Not darkness exactly. He had touched the dark side himself, knew what it felt like from the inside. The hot surge, the immediate expansion of it like a door thrown open onto a very large room. This was not that. This was cold. This was the sensation of approaching something massive and stationary from a great distance, feeling the air change before you could see it, the particular chill of something that had been cold for a very long time. "Master," he said. barely audible, to no one. "What have you done? What are you doing?" He was already running. The Jedi who met Obi-Wan at the temple door were 4 in number: 2 knights on standard watch rotation, a senior Padawan returning from the archives with 3 datapads under her arm, and a temple guard whose role was largely ceremonial at this hour. They looked at him with the instinctive deference that 20 years of reputation warranted. The knights bowed slightly. The Padawan straightened, startled to see him at this hour. "Master Kenobi," one of the knights said, "we weren't informed of your return from Utapapao. Is everything?" The senior Padawan reached out with a force probe. It was instinctive, unconscious, the kind of casual force-touch Jedi used the way other people used eye contact. A simple check of who is this, really, in this moment. She was perhaps 23 years old, and she had very good instincts, which was why she had survived the Clone Wars long enough to be standing in this corridor. She felt what was inside Obi-Wan Kenobi. She recoiled. One sharp step backward, the datapad scattering from her arm, and her hand going to her lightsaber before her mind had finished processing what her force sense had reported. Obi-Wan looked at her. His expression was patient and, in its patience, terrible. "I am sorry," he said. "For all of it." He ignited his blade. He moved through the temple the way he had always moved through it. That was what none of the survivors would be able to adequately explain afterward. Not the violence itself, which they had all in varying degrees been trained to face, but the quality of it, the unhurried competence, the economy. He walked the corridors at the same pace he had always walked them, and every confrontation resolved with the minimum force required to resolve it, and no more. And the precision of it was somehow worse than fury would have been, because fury, you could understand. Fury was a thing you could locate in a person and point to and say, "There, that is why," but this had no why in it, except the terrifying, hollow logic of a man who believed what he was doing was necessary. His Soresu defense turned every fight into a kind of grinding patience. Jedi who came at him with aggressive forms, Ataru, Sheen, the desperate improvised violence of people who knew they were out of time, threw themselves against his guard until they tired, and then the guard became something else. He did not wound unnecessarily. He made the killing blow only when the alternative was prolonging something that was already finished. He wept through all of it, not loudly, not in a way that interrupted his breathing or disturbed his footwork. Tears moved down his face in the same automatic physical way that sweat moves, a thing the body does independent of permission. He did not stop to acknowledge them. He did not wipe them away. He found 3 younglings in a corridor near the central atrium. They were in their training clothes, and their faces were the faces of children who had heard something alarming and come to find out what it was rather than hiding, which was either bravery or the particular foolishness of people who had not yet fully understood what there was to be afraid of. They saw him and stopped. "Master Kenobi," the tallest one said. A human boy, perhaps 10. His voice was working hard to be steady. "What happened?" we heard. Obi-Wan crouched. The audience would brace for this. Anyone who knew what Anakin Skywalker was supposed to have done in a temple corridor with a group of younglings would feel the bottom drop out of their chest at this moment. Obi-Wan was aware, on some level, that he was living inside a horror, that the shape of what he was doing had a shape he could see even through the distortion of the dark side's altered perception, and the younglings were the one place where the shape became unbearable. He reached out with the force. 12 meters behind the children, a section of the corridor wall shifted. A maintenance access panel, steel gray and flush, swinging inward on a hidden mechanism that only someone who had lived in this temple for 35 years would know existed. "Go through that door," he said. "Follow the shaft down 3 levels. There is a landing pad that hasn't been used since before the Clone Wars. Pad 7. The old number, painted over but still there if you know where to look. There will be no one on it." He held each of their eyes in sequence. 1, 2, 3. Do not use your comms. Do not tell anyone your names for a very long time. Grow up. And when the galaxy is different, come back to the light. The first 2 children moved immediately. The third, the tallest boy, the one who had spoken, did not. He stood looking at Obi-Wan with those steady, frightened 10-year-old eyes, and what he saw in Obi-Wan's face made him very still. "Go," Obi-Wan said gently. The boy did not go. "Master Kenobi," he said, with terrible, careful precision. "You don't want to do this." Obi-Wan looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not a crack, not yet, but the suggestion of a line forming in stone under sustained pressure. "I know what I look like to you," he said. "Remember this face, and remember, I failed because I was alone. Don't be alone." The boy ran. Several senior Jedi escaped. Kit Fisto made it out through a secondary hangar, barely. 2 members of the Agricultural Corps who happened to be visiting the archives got out through a lower passage. Yoda, most sensitive of all to the disturbance moving through the temple's living force, feeling it the way a deep-rooted tree feels an axe moving through its outer rings, long before the blow becomes fatal, had begun quiet evacuation protocols 20 minutes before Obi-Wan reached the main gates. Obi-Wan knew this was happening. He could feel the Force presences withdrawing, the temple growing lighter in that specific way that meant people were leaving it. He did not move to intercept them. He told himself this was because interception was inefficient, that the primary objective was the temple itself, the symbolic and material weight of it, not the individuals. He believed this. The dark side had calcified it into something he could not see around. He did not examine why. Of the 17 routes out of the temple, he had chosen to begin with the 12 that were already secured and work methodically toward the remaining 5, which happened to be the 5 that led toward the exits Yoda's evacuation protocols would use. He did not examine it because to examine it would require him to consider the possibility that some part of Obi-Wan Kenobi, underneath everything that had been built on top of him in the last 3 hours, was still making choices, still choosing, in the only way left available to him, to preserve the things he loved. Anakin arrived through a breach in the outer wall 40 minutes after it began. The clones were withdrawing by then, their orders fulfilled, their efficiency complete, falling back in clean formation toward the landing pads. The temple was burning in 3 locations: the North Records Hall, the Council Anteroom, a section of the Padawan dormitories where something had gotten into the walls. The fires were controlled. Not wild, even the burning had been organized. Anakin moved through it. He was not calling out. He had tried that once, at the entrance, and the sound of his own voice in that particular silence had been so wrong that he had stopped. He moved instead in quiet through corridors he had known since childhood, reading the violence the way you read a signature, not what was done, but how, the specific grammar of it, the unmistakable authorship. Here, a sealed doorway, force-locked from the inside, protecting whatever was beyond it. Obi-Wan always sealed doors behind him, always had. Habit of 20 years of moving through hostile territory. Here, a knight's lightsaber on the floor, blade extinguished, owner nowhere. The angle of it suggested it had been placed, not dropped. A small mercy, or its shadow. Here, a burn on the corridor wall at exactly the height of a Soreso circular parry. The scorch pattern of deflected energy redirected precisely, efficiently, with no wasted arc. This was not a monster wearing his master's face. This was his master, every line of it, every choice of it. Anakin stopped in the central atrium and stood in the silence in the distant firelight, and breathed. He heard footsteps, small ones. The boy found him between one breath and the next, appearing from a side corridor, still in his training clothes, face composed in the deliberate way of someone who has decided that composure is the one thing they can control. He stopped when he saw Anakin. He stared with enormous, exhausted eyes that had seen something an hour ago that would live behind them for the rest of his life. He said 5 words. "Master Kenobi did this," the boy said. He cried. Anakin looked at him. He felt the 5 words land one at a time, each one doing its specific damage, and he breathed through it. All of it, the grief and the love and the horror and the particular agony of being right about something you spent 10 years praying you were wrong about. And he did not break. He crouched down to the boy's level. "My name is Anakin," he said quietly. "You're safe now. I have you." The boy sat down on the floor of the burning temple and put his face in his hands, and Anakin put one arm around him and stayed very still, and the fires burned in the north wing. And somewhere in the city, Obi-Wan's Force presence moved steadily away through the dark, cold, and deliberate, and irreversibly gone. Anakin held the child. He chose rescue over revenge. He chose life over justice. He would not go after Obi-Wan tonight. Padmé was standing at the window when he arrived, not watching the city. She had moved past watching the city 20 minutes ago, when the HoloNet feeds started contradicting each other, when the temple's emergency beacon activated and then went silent, when the Chancellor's office issued a statement that was 3 sentences long and explained nothing, and was therefore the most frightening document she had read in 8 years of Senate service. She was standing at the window because it gave her somewhere to put her eyes. That was not the HoloNet. And she was very still because stillness was what she did when the situation required her to think faster than her fear. She heard the door. She turned. Anakin was standing in the entrance with a child she didn't recognize, tucked against his side and dust on his boots, and an expression on his face that she had never seen before and immediately understood completely. She had spent 6 years learning the specific grammar of Anakin Skywalker's face. She knew the anger face and the grief face, and the face he made when he was pretending to be fine, and the face he made in the particular darkness of 3 in the morning when the war had followed him home. This was none of those. This was the face of a man who had looked directly at something catastrophic and decided, in full knowledge of what it was, not to be destroyed by it. She crossed the room. She put both hands on his face. She looked at him. "How bad is it?" she said. Anakin looked back at her. His jaw moved once before the words came. "It's Obi-Wan," he said. It was Obi-Wan. The silence lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Padmé's hands stayed where they were. Something moved through her expression. Not shock, not the collapse of shock, but the specific interior adjustment of a person absorbing an impossible fact and filing it correctly, deciding in the same motion that the fact's impossibility was irrelevant because it had already happened and therefore required a response. She nodded once. "Tell me what we need to do," she said. The boy's name was Senna. She corrected Anakin twice before he got it right. Firmly, with the particular authority of a child who has decided that if her name is the one thing she can insist on, she will insist on it absolutely. She was 7 years old, and she sat at Padmé's kitchen table and drank the cup of something warm that Padmé put in front of her, and did not cry, which was either extraordinary resilience or the temporary numbness of shock. And Anakin suspected it was both simultaneously. He stood at the far end of the room and tried to locate the rage. He had always known where it was. That was the thing about the anger. It was reliable, consistent, always available, the one resource that never ran dry regardless of how depleted everything else became. He had spent 10 years managing it, routing it, using it carefully, and then sealing it back up, and the management had become so automatic that he sometimes forgot it was management and thought it was just his personality. But it was always there, always findable, always ready to be the thing he reached for when the situation turned unbearable. He reached for it now. The place where it lived was quiet, not empty. He could feel the grief moving through him like something structural, like the settlement of a building after an earthquake, deep and slow and total. But the rage that should have been sitting on top of the grief, that had always been sitting on top of the grief every other time something had taken something from him, was not where he expected it. He searched for it the way you search for an object in the dark, padding around the perimeter of a familiar space, certain it must be here, certain he had left it here. He found nothing that felt like a weapon. He put his face in his hands for 10 seconds. He took them away. He looked at Padmé across the room, who was talking to Senna in a low voice about something unrelated and deliberate, giving the child the normality of ordinary conversation, the way you give someone in shock a blanket. He looked at the HoloNet screen still running silent on the wall, its images cycling through Senate footage and temple smoke, and the Chancellor's face, restored now, clean now, giving an address to a city that was trying to understand what had happened to it. He began to think about what needed to happen next. I wanted to hate him, he thought, not for the last time. I tried to find it, that rage I always had, always knew was there. I reached for it like a weapon and found nothing. Just, he was my master. He taught me everything I know, and he broke, and I didn't. And I don't know what to do with that. He crossed to Padmé. He put his hand on the back of her chair. "We need to move," he said, within the hour. He found Yoda in the Force before he found him in the city. The presence was still there, unmistakable, 900 years of accumulated contact with the living Force, creating a signature so distinct it was less like a person and more like a location, but diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical injury. Yoda was not wounded. He was bereaved. What Obi-Wan had done to the temple had moved through its living Force like a severing, and Yoda, most deeply rooted of any of them in that current, had felt it the way a body feels the removal of something it grew around. Not a cut, a missing. Anakin tracked the presence to a secondary docking bay in the lower levels of the Senate district, 3 kilometers from Padmé's apartment. He took a civilian speeder, moved without lights, arrived to find Yoda at the edge of a platform, with 2 temple guards flanking him and a small civilian transport behind them, and the particular posture of a very old, very powerful being who was marshaling every resource he had left in order to keep moving. Yoda looked at him when he landed. "Surprised you are not young Skywalker," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Anakin stepped off the speeder and stood in front of the ancient master and told him the truth. "I felt it. For years. Something wrong. I thought it was me." Yoda was quiet for a moment. His ears moved slightly, the small, involuntary adjustment that in Yoda indicated thinking so deep it was almost physical. "Wrong, it was not," he said finally. "Right, it was in the wrong direction. The same wound. Different man." Anakin held that. The same wound. He had spent years believing that what was wrong with Anakin Skywalker was specifically and uniquely wrong with Anakin Skywalker. A flaw of character, an excess of feeling, something that made him dangerous in a way that other Jedi were not. He had never once considered that what was wrong with him and what was wrong with Obi-Wan might be the same thing, expressing itself differently in 2 different men, because one of them burned and the other sealed. He helped Yoda aboard. Senna was already on the transport by the time Anakin returned with Yoda, Padmé having moved her there with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything Padmé did in a crisis. The girl stood at the entrance of the ship's small passenger cabin with her arms crossed and her chin at an angle that communicated without ambiguity that she was not waiting for permission to board, and had not been waiting for it. She looked at Anakin. "Are you going to stop him?" she said. He crouched, the same way Obi-Wan had crouched in the corridor, and he saw her register the similarity, watched her small face process it, and decide to hold still. He held her gaze. "I'm going to try something harder than stopping him," he said. "I'm going to reach him." Senna looked at him for a long moment with those vast, exhausted eyes. "He said not to be alone," she said. "I know," Anakin said. He was right about that part. She went inside. The ship was nothing. A mid-range Corellian freighter, civilian registry, the kind of vessel that moved through Coruscant's traffic lanes 1,000 times a day carrying cargo too ordinary to inspect. Anakin had flown worse. He had flown considerably worse, once, in a situation involving half a wing and a separatist blockade, and Obi-Wan talking him through the math of an impossible approach vector in that particular calm voice he used when the situation was most desperate. The voice that somehow made the impossible feel like a procedure. He did not think about that voice now. He filed it away in the place he was building for things he couldn't afford to carry in his hands yet. The clones caught them 2 blocks from the pad, a patrol and 2 gunships coming in fast from the north, communication channels lighting up as the freighter's registry got flagged. Someone had been efficient, someone had anticipated civilian transport, and the tractor beam of the lead gunship engaged at 60 meters and began dragging them sideways and down. Anakin flew into the gap between 2 Senate towers that was, by any reasonable measure, not wide enough for the ship. It was, by 2 meters on either side, exactly wide enough. He took them through 3 canyons, 1 roof-level skim that scraped the freighter's undercarriage against a communications array, 1 dead drop into a lower traffic lane that put them momentarily behind a cargo hauler large enough to block sensor returns, and then straight up, full thrust, vertical, burning for altitude in a way that civilian freighters were not rated for. And this particular one managed anyway, screaming through the cloud layer and into Coruscant's upper atmosphere with the lead gunship's tractor beams cycling up for a second attempt at maximum range. He hit the hyperspace coordinates that Padmé had already plotted. She had done it while he was flying, 1 hand on the console and 1 on her seat's armrest, and her face completely composed. And jumped. The stars went long and blue, and then disappeared. Silence. The particular silence of hyperspace, which was not really silence but the complete replacement of all familiar sounds with a low, omnidirectional hum that the brain after a while interpreted as nothing because it never changed. Anakin sat in the pilot's seat for a long moment after the jump and looked at his own hands on the controls. In the passenger cabin behind him, Yoda was meditating. He could feel it, the deep rhythmic quality of it, like slow breathing heard through a wall. Senna had finally slept, her force presence the soft, unguarded thing that children's presences became in sleep, open and undefended. Padmé came forward and sat in the co-pilot's chair, and looked at him. "Why Obi-Wan?" she said finally. I thought Palpatine wanted you." Anakin kept his eyes on the viewport. The blue of hyperspace moved against his face. He did, he said. He showed me visions, how it would happen, what I'd become. He had it all planned out. He paused, and I made a different choice. So he found someone else to make a different choice. Padmé was quiet for a moment. Someone who wouldn't say no, she said. Anakin's hands moved off the controls. He put them in his lap. Someone who said yes for all the right reasons, he said. That's what makes it worse. She reached over and put her hand over his. She didn't say anything because there was nothing to say to that, and Padmé had always understood the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that needed holding. Yoda came forward an hour into the jump. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a physical weight that had nothing to do with age, settling into the space behind the two front seats and folding his hands over his gimmer stick and looking at the hyperspace stream with eyes that seemed to be seeing something further away than the viewport could account for. He told Anakin what he had decided, that the traditional response, mobilize, coordinate, strike, was the wrong architecture for this particular problem. That fighting Darth Imperius would work, militarily, eventually, if enough surviving Jedi could be gathered, and enough Republic loyalists could be organized, and enough time could be bought. But that winning that fight would mean losing Obi-Wan permanently. That underneath everything Palpatine had poured into him, the man was still there, the grief was still there, the love, buried very deep, under a great weight of dark but present. Fight Darth Imperius we might, Yoda said, but Obi-Wan, lost him forever that would make. Inside him still, the man is, the grief, the love, buried under much dark, but there. A Jedi fights to destroy the darkness, but only love can reach the man underneath it. Anakin listened to this. I'm not a good Jedi, Master Yoda, he said. Yoda looked at him. Something moved in the ancient face that was not quite a smile, and not quite sorrow but occupied some territory between the two. No, he said, a perfect one you are becoming. The convoy appeared on sensors 40 minutes later. 3 ships, Alderaanian registry, running quiet in a system too remote to appear on standard Imperial navigation charts. Padmé had reached Bail Organa on an encrypted channel before they jumped. Bail had moved fast. Anakin brought them alongside the lead ship and matched velocity, and opened the docking tube. He sat for a moment, after the connection confirmed, looking at the viewport, at the stars visible through the thin dark beyond the hyperspace corridor's edge. He raised one hand and pressed it flat against the transparasteel. The gesture had no specific intention behind it. He was not reaching for anything. He was not searching. He was simply present, open, maintaining a contact with the force that he refused to sever, holding the thread of his awareness in the direction of a man who was somewhere behind them in a galaxy that was already becoming a different shape. He stayed like that for a long moment. Then he took his hand from the glass. He stood. He went to check on Senna. The thread stayed open behind him like a door held ajar, letting in a cold he had no intention of closing out. 6 months after the night the temple burned, the Galactic Empire was 14 weeks old, and already permanent. That was the thing no one said aloud in the Senate chambers, or the military briefing rooms, or the encrypted rebel communications that Bail Organa's network passed between sympathetic systems like contraband. Not that the Empire had happened, but that it had happened so completely. Palpatine had not seized power. He had revealed it. The infrastructure was already there. The clone army, the emergency legislation, the communication networks, the loyalty structures built into every level of Republic governance across a decade of war. He had simply removed the pretense that any of it served anything other than him. The Senate still sat. Technically, its sessions were longer than they used to be and accomplished less, which was, if you understood the architecture, the point. A Senate that meets and deliberates and produces nothing is more useful to an autocrat than no Senate at all, because it gives the population somewhere to direct the energy of political hope, while the actual decisions happen elsewhere, in rooms without windows, by people without titles that appear in the public record. Darth Imperius had no title in the public record. He was not a general. He was not an admiral. He was not the Emperor's enforcer in any sense that could be pointed to in a document, or explained to a junior officer, without the explanation becoming, itself, classified. He existed in the apparatus the way a load-bearing element exists in a structure, essential, invisible, the thing everything else rested on without anyone outside the building quite understanding why the building stood. What he did, in practical terms, was think. He sat in command centers on Coruscant, and in the flag rooms of Imperial Star Destroyers, and at the head of intelligence briefing tables, and he thought with the same systematic, patient quality he had always brought to any problem, and then he told people what to do, and they did it, because the people he told had learned very quickly that the quality of his thinking was not a thing to argue with. He had redesigned the Imperial intelligence apparatus in 11 weeks. The Jedi Safehouse networks had been his first project. He knew them the way he knew the temple's maintenance corridors, not from files, from memory, from 30 years of moving through them. He knew which systems had populations sympathetic enough to hide Force sensitives long-term. He knew which smuggling routes the Order had used during the Clone Wars for supply and extraction. He knew the specific gravitational quirks of the systems near the unknown regions that made hyperspace navigation unpredictable and therefore attractive to people who needed to disappear. He did not send troops to these locations immediately. He watched them. He mapped the patterns of movement in and out. He identified the supply chains, who was bringing food, who was providing power cells, which sympathetic merchants were billing for cargo that didn't match their manifests. He built a complete picture of each network before he touched any of it, because a surgeon who cuts before he understands the anatomy causes more damage than the disease. Then he cut, not violently, where he could avoid it. He was not interested in violence as an end. He gave each network 3 opportunities to disperse, anonymous warnings through channels that couldn't be traced back to Imperial intelligence, the kind of warnings that a rational person would take seriously, and an irrational person would dismiss and therefore sort themselves into a category that required different handling. The ones who took the warnings and ran, he let run. They were not organized. They were not a threat yet. Scattered, leaderless, surviving on instinct. They were a problem for later, and later, properly managed, was a long time away. The ones who didn't run required a different conversation. The operation on Lothal took 4 days from initial contact to resolution. 3 Jedi, a knight named Orvax, a Padawan, and a civilian Force sensitive who had attached herself to them sometime after the temple fell, had been sheltering in a farming commune in the planet's northern continent, integrated into the community well enough that the local population had begun, in the organic way of communities that protect their own, to genuinely not see them, not concealing them exactly, simply not noticing them in the specific way that people choose not to notice things they have decided to protect. Obi-Wan sent Cody to talk to the commune's elected council, not clone troops, not intelligence officers, Cody, in civilian clothes, with a message that was not a threat. The message said, "The 3 individuals currently sheltering with you will be escorted to a secure facility on Lothal. They will not be harmed. They will be held and monitored. If the political situation changes, and political situations change, their circumstances will be reviewed. If the commune cooperates, there is no record of the commune's involvement in this matter, and no further Imperial interest in this community. If the commune does not cooperate, the record will reflect whatever the record needs to reflect, and the Imperial interest will be extensive and prolonged." The council deliberated for 6 hours, which was longer than Obi-Wan had estimated and shorter than Cody had predicted. The 3 Jedi came out the following morning. Obi-Wan watched their transport lift from the landing pad below and climb into Lothal's pale sky. Cody stood beside him. The wind off the plains moved through the space between them, carrying the smell of something agricultural and distant. An aide appeared at his elbow to confirm the next briefing. He nodded once. The aide withdrew. The transport became a point of light and then became nothing. In the silence after it disappeared, the name arrived the way it always arrived, without warning, without invitation, surfacing from somewhere below the architecture of duty and decision, and landing in his consciousness with the soft, unavoidable weight of a stone, settling to the bottom of still water, Satine. He stood with it for a moment. He allowed it exactly that, a moment, and then he put it back. "Commander," he said. Cody appeared at his left shoulder with the precise, practiced positioning of a man who had spent years learning the exact distance that constituted available without intrusive. "Sir." "The briefing," Obi-Wan said. A pause. It was a very short pause. In anyone else, it would not have registered. "Sir," Cody said, not moving immediately, "do you require anything before we proceed?" Obi-Wan looked at the empty sky where the transport had been. "The briefing, Commander," he said. Another pause. Shorter. "Yes, sir," Cody said. They went inside. What Darth Imperius believed, in the deep structural architecture of his conviction where the dark side had done its most thorough work, was this. that the galaxy Palpatine was building, guided and moderated and kept from its worst excesses by Obi-Wan's presence within it, was a safer galaxy than the one that would exist without him. He believed this the way a man believes in the evidence of his own senses. He had watched the Republic fail. Not once, not as an aberration, but systematically, structurally, across decades of wars fought for Senate budgets and diplomatic timelines, and the institutional caution of an order that confused non-attachment with non-intervention. He had watched people die in the gap between what the Republic was supposed to be and what it actually did. He had carried those people. He had stopped carrying them by deciding that the gap would close, not through the Republic's mechanisms. Those had failed, demonstrably and repeatedly, through the application of clear authority and consistent force, neither more nor less than the situation required, directed by someone with the discipline to use them proportionately. He believed he was protecting Anakin. This was the deepest and most load-bearing of his convictions, the one on which everything else was balanced. He did not allow himself to examine it directly, because examining it directly would require him to notice that the empire he was helping to build was not a structure in which Anakin Skywalker would be safe from anything. He had constructed, across 6 months, an elaborate architecture of reasoning that began with Anakin must be protected, and arrived at therefore this is justified, without ever passing through the territory where the two propositions might be tested against each other. The dark side was, among other things, an extraordinary tool for preventing that kind of examination. In the Emperor's private reception room, 3 floors above the office where Obi-Wan had made his choice, Palpatine sat with a single aide and discussed his most effective instrument with the dispassionate precision of a man reviewing a quarterly report. He has no desire for the throne, Palpatine said. He was looking at a holofield projection of Imperial territorial expansion. 16 systems in 6 months, most of them absorbed without significant military engagement. No ambition that extends beyond the work itself. He serves. Completely. Perfectly. He paused. It is almost touching. The aide waited. Sadly, Palpatine continued in the tone of a man noting a minor engineering limitation. The quality that makes him perfect also makes him vulnerable. His attachment to Skywalker. He touched the edge of the holofield and it collapsed. He kept it, deeply buried, but present, and it will break him. Should we sever it, my lord? Palpatine looked at the aide for a moment with the expression he used when a question was not quite foolish enough to be worth contempt. No, he said. A man who believes he is protecting someone is capable of anything. Anything at all. The belief is the engine. He folded his hands. And then, when the moment comes, when Skywalker forces the choice, the breaking will be magnificent. Not destructive. Instructive. He will become something better after it. More honest. More mine. He dismissed the aide with a gesture. He sat alone in the room for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, in the way of men who are thinking about timelines too long to map in a single sitting. Anakin had grown a beard. It had happened gradually the way most changes in exile happen, not as a decision but as an accumulation of days in which the decision not to shave was made by default, by the press of other priorities, until enough days had accumulated that the beard was simply part of the face, and removing it would have been the active choice. He wore civilian clothes over old Jedi tunics. Not disguise. Anyone who looked at him directly and knew what they were looking for would find it. But adaptation. The practical shedding of an identity that had become, in the current political climate, a liability for everyone around him. He was different. This was what Padmé noticed most consistently. Not the beard, not the clothes, but the quality of him, the texture. The urgency that had always been his most distinctive characteristic, the forward momentum, the sense of a man perpetually moving toward or away from something at a speed slightly above what the situation required. That was gone. Not replaced by stillness, exactly, replaced by something more deliberate. He thought before he spoke. He stopped mid-sentence occasionally, not from uncertainty, but from care, from the visible process of choosing the right word rather than the available one. He sat with Padmé every morning and talked about Obi-Wan. Not about what Obi-Wan had done. They had covered that territory thoroughly in the first weeks, from every angle, and had arrived at the place on the other side of that conversation where it becomes simply a known fact that is lived with rather than processed further. He talked about Obi-Wan the person, the things he had never said while the saying of them would have been easy. He talked to Yoda about Satine, whom he had known existed but whose significance he had not fully understood until now. He trained every day. He meditated, which was something the younger version of himself had treated as an obligation, and the current version understood as the only tool that actually worked. He was doing the work. He did not speak about this directly. He did not have a framework for describing it that didn't sound either therapeutic or religious. And both registers felt wrong for what it actually was, which was simply the daily practice of not becoming the thing he had feared becoming. The daily choice to feel what was there and not be destroyed by it. The discipline not of suppression, but of presence. He was, Padmé thought, watching him across the table one morning while Senna argued with Yoda about the correct pronunciation of a Huttese navigational term. Becoming someone she had not known was available inside him. Bail Organa's intelligence arrived on a morning that looked like every other morning. He came aboard their ship personally, which meant it was not the kind of information he would put in a transmission. He sat across from Anakin and Padmé at the narrow table in the freighter's common area and placed a datapad face down between them, and looked at Anakin for a moment before he spoke. Darth Imperius had been given an order. The Kyber crystal caves on Ilum were to be destroyed. The operation was dual purpose: deny the surviving Jedi a source of new lightsaber crystals, and erase the most sacred site of Jedi initiation in a single symbolic act. The timing was set. The Imperial unit tasked with the operation was already en route. Bail had worked out carefully and with considerable reluctance that there was a window. Narrow, closing. Yoda's response, when Bail finished, was immediate and without inflection. Someone must go. Anakin looked at the datapad, face down on the table between them. He did not turn it over. "We can put together a strike team," Bail said. "Clone defectors, some of Mon Mothma's." "No," Anakin said. Bail stopped. "Anakin, an army won't help." He looked up. "This isn't that kind of battle." The room was quiet for a moment. Senna, who had come in partway through and was standing in the doorway with the particular stillness of a child who understands that the adults are deciding something important, looked at him with those vast eyes. Anakin looked back at her. He thought of a man crouching in a corridor, weeping, opening a door in a wall and telling 3 children to run toward it. He thought of 5 words spoken in a burning temple. He reached out, very quietly, through the Force. Not searching, not trying to locate anything, simply maintaining the contact he had maintained every day for 6 months. The thread that ran from him to somewhere cold and dark and very far away, the thread he refused to sever, the door he refused to close. It was still there. He put his hand flat on the table. "I'll go alone," he said. Padmé did not ask him not to go. She had never been a woman who asked people not to do necessary things, and she had spent enough years loving Anakin Skywalker to understand the specific architecture of his necessities. What was fear dressed as duty? What was impulse dressed as strategy? And what was the genuine, unperformable kind? The kind that had its roots so deep in who he was that asking him not to do it would be asking him to be someone he wasn't. She could tell the difference by now. She had learned it the hard way, across years of watching him leave. This was the genuine kind, so she helped him pack instead. It was a small bag. He had learned, in 6 months of exile, that the volume of what you carried had almost no relationship to whether you survived, and a close and consistent relationship to whether you could move fast when moving fast was the difference. She folded 2 sets of Jedi tunics, the old ones, the ones that had been at the bottom of the bag since Coruscant, and handed them to him, and he packed them without comment. He had made a specific choice about what to wear. Not the armored variant he'd used through most of the Clone Wars, the blacks that were practical and combat-rated and looked like what they were, a soldier's clothing, designed for attrition, the traditional robes, the ones that were slightly too formal for a battlefield and slightly too worn for a diplomatic function, that existed in the particular middle space of Jedi identity that was neither warrior nor politician, but something older than both. The ones that looked most like Obi-Wan's. Padmé noticed. She didn't say anything about it immediately. She straightened the collar of the outer robe with both hands, the small adjustment of someone who needs to be useful and has found the scale of usefulness available to her. "He'll know it's deliberate," she said. "That's the point." She looked at his face. He was watching her hands on the collar, not her eyes. "Anakin," he looked up. "If he doesn't," she started and stopped differently. "If reaching him isn't possible, if what Palpatine has done is, then I'll know that too," he said, "and I'll deal with what's actually in front of me instead of what I was afraid of." She held his face in her hands the same way she had in the apartment on Coruscant, the night all of this began. The gesture had become, in 6 months, its own language, a full sentence compressed into a touch, meaning something like, "I see you clearly, and I am not afraid of what I see." "Come back," she said. "Always," he said. And it was not bravado. It was a statement of intention from a man who understood that intentions were not guarantees, and was making it anyway. She kissed him. He picked up the bag. Yoda was waiting at the ship. He was standing at the base of the ramp, with his hands on his gimmer stick, and his eyes already open, which meant he had not been meditating. He had been waiting specifically, consciously, which was unusual enough that Anakin slowed as he approached. The old master looked at him for a long moment, at the robes, at the bag, at whatever it was in Anakin's Force presence that Yoda was most sensitive to, and that Anakin had never been able to fully perceive in himself. Whatever he found, he seemed to have expected it. "Afraid you are not," Yoda said. It wasn't a question. "I'm afraid," Anakin said, "just not of the right things anymore." Yoda made a sound that might have been the beginning of something, a word or its absence, and then was quiet. He looked down at his hands on the stick for a moment. "The caves," he said. "When you find them, the crystals will speak, not in words, but you will understand." He paused. They knew him. Before, they will know what he has become. Let them. Anakin nodded. And Anakin. He stopped. "Fight him. Do not try to," Yoda said. "Reach him. These are not the same thing. Easy to forget it is when he makes them feel like the same thing. He will try. Confuse the two. He will try to make you. I know." "No, you do," Yoda agreed. "But knowing and doing, the space between them, that is where Jedi are made or broken." The ancient eyes, 9 centuries deep, settled on him with something that was not quite sorrow and not quite pride, and contained too much of both to be named cleanly. The space between, that is where you have always lived. A harder place than most. A more honest one. Anakin looked at him. "You could have told me that 15 years ago," he said. "Ready to hear it, you were not," Yoda said. "Ready now, you are." He stepped back from the ramp. "Go. And Anakin, take nothing with you that you are not willing to lose." Anakin looked down at the bag in his hand. He set it down at the base of the ramp. He went up, alone. The jump to Ilum took 19 hours. He spent most of it in the co-pilot's seat with the autopilot engaged, not sleeping. He was not avoiding sleep. He had learned in 6 months that the old relationship between him and sleep, the one characterized by nightmares and resistance and waking in the dark with his heart doing things hearts weren't designed to sustain, had changed. He slept when he was tired now. He woke when he was done. The nightmares had not disappeared, but they had become somehow less sovereign. They visited. They did not govern. He was not sleeping because he was thinking, which was different. He had fought Obi-Wan once, not seriously, training, demonstrations, the 1,000 half-serious exchanges of 20 years of partnership, where neither of them was genuinely trying to win, and both of them were, at the same time, constantly reading the other. He knew Obi-Wan's soresu the way he knew his own breathing. From the inside, from years of being on the other side of it, from the specific experience of throwing himself against that defense repeatedly, and learning slowly what it actually was. Soresu was not patience. That was the misunderstanding. People watched Obi-Wan in combat and saw a man who waited, who deflected, who outlasted, and they called it patience because it looked like patience from the outside. But from the inside, from the position of someone trying to find a way through it, it was something different. It was listening. Soresu was a form built on the principle that if you listened long enough and completely enough to what your opponent was doing, they would eventually tell you everything. Their fear, their commitment, the precise shape of what they most wanted and most dreaded. Obi-Wan was the greatest listener Anakin had ever known, which meant that fighting him was not the problem. Fighting him was, in fact, the thing Obi-Wan would be most comfortable with, most prepared for, most capable of turning into exactly the kind of exchange that ended with Anakin either defeated or committed to a violence he didn't want to commit. Yoda was right. Fighting and reaching were not the same thing. And Obi-Wan, consciously or not, would use the former to prevent the latter. He thought about this for a long time. He thought about a man crouching in front of a 10-year-old boy in a burning corridor, weeping, opening a door in a wall. He thought about what it cost to do that, what it meant that in the middle of everything Palpatine had poured into him, with the dark side calcified around every wound, and every loss and every year of suppressed grief turned into architecture. There had still been an Obi-Wan underneath who could not kill children, who had opened the door before he consciously chose to open it, because some things run deeper than ideology. He thought about what else might run that deep. Ilum arrived on the sensors 12 hours out as a mass of white in a field of dark, a planet so thoroughly covered in ice that its albedo made it visible long before anything else resolved. No Imperial signatures yet. He was ahead of the operation, but not by much. The window Bale had identified was measured in hours, not days. He brought the ship down through cloud cover that was less like weather and more like a physical substance. Dense, white, completely opaque, the kind of atmosphere that swallowed a ship whole and gave it back to the surface without ceremony. Wind pressed against the hull with the flat, constant pressure of something that had been doing this for a very long time, and saw no reason to stop. The surface appeared below him without warning, white resolving from white, the slight texture of glacial pressure ridges giving the ground its only visible feature. He set down on a ridge 2 kilometers from the temple entrance, close enough to reach on foot, far enough that the ship's heat signature wouldn't immediately announce itself to anyone already on the surface. He sat in the cockpit for a moment after the engines cycled down. The cold was audible. Wind against the hull at a frequency that was almost below hearing, felt more in the chest than in the ears. Beneath it, so faint he might have been imagining it, something else. A resonance, a depth charge of sound just at the threshold of perception. The kyber crystals, in the mountain, in their caves, in their hundreds of formations, humming the way they had hummed for thousands of years. He reached out through the Force. Ilum was present in the Force the way very old, very significant places were present. Not loudly, not with the particular weight of tragedy or glory, but with a deep, settled quality, like bedrock. It knew itself. It had known itself for a long time. He felt the temple 2 kilometers away. He felt the caves below it, the kyber formations, the resonance coming up through the rock, and the ice and the accumulated centuries of Jedi presence. Children had come here and become Jedi here. He had come here, once, and come back different. Everyone who found their crystal in those caves had come back different. He felt something else, not yet present on the surface, but coming, an hour away, maybe less. A ship in the upper atmosphere, running a descent profile, carrying within it a Force signature he would have known at 10 times the distance. Cold, vast, controlled. And underneath all of it, underneath the cold and the dark and the layers of 6 months of Darth Imperius, something else. Something that had been sealed for so long it had no voice left. Something that had been running a low, continuous signal for 35 years, looking for a frequency anyone would hear it on. Grief turned almost entirely to architecture. Almost. Anakin closed his eyes. He thought of Padmé's hand straightening his collar. He thought of Yoda at the base of the ramp. He thought of Senna, standing in a doorway with her arms crossed, saying he said not to be alone. He thought of a 10-year-old boy he had held on a burning floor, and what it meant that Obi-Wan had let that boy go. He put his hand against the cold viewport. He left it there for a long moment, feeling the temperature of the glass against his palm, the specific sensation of something cold that you are choosing not to pull away from. He opened the hatch. The wind came in immediately, absolute and indifferent, carrying ice crystals that stung the exposed skin of his face and hands, and found the gap at the collar of his robes, and moved down the back of his neck with the casual intimacy of a place that does not care whether you are ready for it. He stepped out onto the ice. The mountain was ahead of him. The temple was inside it. The crystals were below that, in their caves, humming. He walked toward it. He did not run. There was nothing ahead of him that could be helped by running. What was ahead of him required the thing that had always been hardest for him, and was now, after 6 months of daily practice in a freighter common room with Padmé and Yoda, and one fierce 7-year-old, more available than it had ever been. He walked at the pace of a man who has decided what he is going to do, and is simply going to do it. The ice held under his boots, the wind pushed back flat and constant. He walked. Obi-Wan turned slowly. Not defensively. There was no flinch, no tactical repositioning, no hand moving toward the lightsaber at his belt. He simply turned, the way a man turns when he hears his name spoken by someone he was not expecting, and is taking a moment before he decides what the sound means. He completed the turn and stood facing Anakin across 30 meters of crystal cave, and his face in the blue-white glow of the undamaged formations was not the face of Darth Imperius. It was Obi-Wan's face. All of it. every line of it. The yellow eyes were wrong. They were always wrong. They would always be wrong. But underneath them, the structure of the face was unchanged. The particular set of the mouth that meant he was thinking carefully. The slight furrow between the brows that meant he had found something unexpected and was deciding how to approach it. The look he had given Anakin 1,000 times across training rooms and battlefields and the narrow corridors of too many starships. The look that said, "I see you," specifically as distinct from everything else in this room. "And I am taking you seriously." He was taking Anakin seriously now. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The crystals hummed around them, the living ones brighter now. They had been brightening since Anakin walked in, rising to meet his Force presence with the particular warmth of things that recognize something they were made to recognize. The demolished sections were dark and jagged. Formations collapsed into rubble. The silence in those gaps rung in the way of absences that used to be full. Obi-Wan looked at the traditional robes, at the open hands, at the stillness. Something moved behind his eyes that was not the dark side, and was not its absence. "You shouldn't have come alone," he said. His voice was the same. That was the thing Anakin had not been prepared for, had told himself he was prepared for, and discovered he was not. The measured cadence of it, the particular warmth that lived underneath the precision, the voice that had been the most constant sound of his life for 20 years. It was the same voice. "There's no other way to have this conversation," Anakin said. "This is not a conversation." Obi-Wan's hands stayed at his sides. "This is a farewell. Leave, Anakin. I have work to do. I don't want to fight you." Anakin looked at him across the cave. "I know," he said. "I don't want to fight you either. I came to listen." The word landed between them. Obi-Wan's mouth opened slightly, closed. Something happened in his expression that was too small and too fast to name. A microfracture in the surface of a very large and carefully maintained structure. "Listen," he said. He said the word as though he was testing it for structural integrity, as though it was from a language he had spoken once and had not used in a very long time. Anakin waited. When Obi-Wan began to speak, it was with the tone he had always used when presenting an argument he believed completely, not the tone of persuasion, not the rhetorical shaping of someone trying to convince. The tone of a man laying out an analysis, a teacher explaining something he considered self-evident to a student who needed to understand it. "The Jedi Order," he said, "was designed to fail." He moved slightly, not toward Anakin, laterally, a step to his left, and Anakin recognized it as the unconscious movement of a man who thinks better when he's in motion, who is always processed while pacing, who spent 20 years walking the corridors of the temple, because stillness made the thinking too loud. The code required us to detach from every person and everything we loved. It told us that attachment was the path to the dark side, that love was a liability, that grief was a self-indulgence. And then it sent us into a war, and gave us soldiers who had names, who had faces, who told us about their brothers, and expected us to command them to their deaths without feeling the weight of it. He looked at Anakin directly. "I watched you, all these years, fight against who you were. The passion, the attachment, the council called it weakness. I called it weakness." He paused. "I was wrong," he said. "It was the only real thing about either of us, and the Order took it from you, took it from both of us, and gave us a void in its place, and called that void serenity. I couldn't do it anymore." Anakin held this for a moment. "So you did all of this," he said quietly. "The temple, the purge, the empire, because you couldn't detach." "I did this," Obi-Wan said, and something sharpened in his voice. Not anger, precision, the specific quality of a man who needs to be understood correctly, because someone had to take the mess the Jedi made and put it in order. Because someone had to act absolutely, without hesitation, without the paralysis of Senate votes and council deliberations, and the endless, grinding machinery of institutions that valued their own continuity more than the people they were supposed to protect. He stopped. "Because Satine is dead, Anakin. Because Qui-Gon died on a floor while I watched through a wall. Because I commanded men for 3 years and buried them and was not allowed to grieve a single one." His voice did not break on any of those sentences. It stayed level all the way through. That was, somehow, the worst thing about it, the absolute steadiness with which he said all of it, the way the losses were enumerated without inflection, the way a man recites a list of facts that are too heavy to carry with any feeling, because the feeling is not something he has access to anymore. "I know," Anakin said. "You don't." "I know," Anakin said again, and the repetition was not argument, it was confirmation. "I hear you. I am not dismissing it." Obi-Wan went still. He took one step forward. Just one, careful and deliberate, the way a man steps onto ice he is not certain of. His yellow eyes moved across Anakin's face, with the searching quality Anakin remembered from the hardest conversations of his life. The conversations after Mortis, after Kadavo, after the council sessions that had gone badly and left both of them sitting in silence in the debriefing room afterward, neither of them sure how to start. "Join me," Obi-Wan said. His voice had dropped. It was private now, the register he used for things that weren't for anyone else to hear. "Not as a Sith, as what you are. What I should have let you be." He stopped. "Come and help me build what the Republic never could. An order where people don't die for nothing. Where Padmé never has to fear another war. Where your children grow up in a galaxy that is, finally still." He said Padmé's name the way he said all names he was careful with. Precisely, as if the word itself was significant. He said your children with something that was not quite grief and not quite longing. Anakin was quiet for a long time. He looked at Obi-Wan across the cave, and he did what he had practiced doing for 6 months in a freighter common room, with the Force as his instrument and his own worst memories as his material. He looked completely. He let himself see what was actually there without flinching from it, without the protective instinct to reduce it to something manageable. He saw the grief underneath the yellow eyes. He saw the weight, not as a metaphor but as something structural, something that had been added to a man's posture over 35 years, in increments small enough to miss, until suddenly he was carrying it all, and couldn't remember standing upright. He saw Qui-Gon in the set of the jaw, and Satine in the particular quality of the steadiness, the way someone goes very still when the only alternative is to fall apart. He saw 600 clone troopers in the hollow space behind the composure. He saw all the years of performing serenity until the performance became the thing itself, and there was nothing left underneath it to anchor you when the structure failed. He saw himself. The version of himself that could have been, was nearly, had stood at the edge of on Geonosis and Tatooine, and a dozen other places if he hadn't had Padmé to come home to. The version that processes grief by calcifying it instead of surviving it. His heart broke cleanly, without drama, the way something breaks that has been under sustained pressure for a very long time. "You didn't bring peace, Master," he said, slowly, with absolute gentleness, the way you say something to a person you love that is going to hurt them and that you are saying anyway because they need to hear it. You just made the galaxy as empty as you feel. The silence afterward was very complete. Somewhere in the cave, deeper in, a crystal cracked, a single sharp sound, clean as a snapped bone, and then nothing. Obi-Wan's face changed. The tenderness didn't leave. It was still there. Underneath. It was always underneath, which was the truest and most terrible thing about all of it, but the dark side moved over the wound, like a hand closing over a flame. The careful control returned, and under the control something that was not quite anger, but was its very cold cousin. "You can't understand," he said. "You never had to carry the silence." "I know what silence costs," Anakin said. "Padmé taught me to talk. Ahsoka taught me to listen. You taught me everything else." He paused. "But this was the one lesson you never gave me, because you never learned it yourself." The lightsaber came off Obi-Wan's belt in one motion. The red blade opened the cave, and the kyber crystals, every one of them in the surrounding walls, the living ones, the ones that had been brightening since Anakin arrived, the ones that had survived the demolition teams and the dark side resonance, and 6 months of Darth Imperius moving through spaces built for something entirely opposite, screamed. It was not like any sound the cave had made before. It was the sound of a living thing in pain, distributed across 100 crystal formations simultaneously, a dissonant chorus of cracking harmonics and shearing frequencies that came from every direction at once. The blood crystal in Obi-Wan's saber was vibrating against the natural ones in the walls, and the natural ones were fighting back, and the sound they made together was the sound of something that did not want to coexist with itself. Anakin ignited his blade. Blue opened against the red, and the crystals that had been screaming rose to meet it, not canceling the red frequency, that was still there, still awful, but adding to it, building over it, the living crystals singing at the blue blade's harmonic the way a choir holds a note against dissonance. The cave filled with both sounds layered over each other, the pained shriek and the song, the broken and the whole, intertwined in a way that was somehow more disturbing than either alone. Obi-Wan looked at him across two lit blades. "I am sorry, Anakin," he said, very quietly. The tenderness was back. It was always there. It never left. That was the unbearable thing about facing him. "I hope you understand. This is the only mercy I know how to give." Anakin looked back at him. "Then let me teach you a different one," he said. Obi-Wan moved first. The first exchange lasted 4 seconds. Obi-Wan came forward with the controlled inevitability of a tide. Not rushing, not committing to any single line of attack. His red blade moving in the low, economical arcs of Soresu's opening guard that Anakin had seen 10,000 times and could read in his sleep. The blade was almost incidental to it. What Obi-Wan deployed first was presence, the particular quality of force stillness that his form generated, a negative pressure that pulled the space around him into alignment with his intention. The air near him felt different, denser, like approaching something very large and very cold. Anakin met the first strike with Gemso's answering weight, a full-body parry that used the blade as an extension of his center of gravity rather than a separate instrument, absorbing Obi-Wan's arc and redirecting it without fighting it directly. The contact lasted half a second. The crystals in the walls amplified it into something vast, the clash of the two blades producing a harmonic that expanded through the cave like a stone dropped in still water. Rings of sound moving outward through formations of blue-white crystal, and bouncing back changed. They separated, reset. Anakin pressed forward. His Gemso was not what it had been during the Clone Wars. The younger version, the one Obi-Wan had trained and argued with, and occasionally watched with the private, complicated pride of a master whose student has surpassed him in raw power, while remaining infuriatingly not quite surpassed in judgment, had fought the form at maximum intensity always. Force pushed through every blow, always. It had been extraordinary and expensive, and frequently more effective than it had any right to be, and it had also been the fighting style of a man who was, at his foundation, running on something he didn't fully control. This was different. Every strike was committed, but none of them were reckless. He was lifting weight rather than swinging it. Deliberate, sequential, each blow designed not to break through Obi-Wan's defense, but to move it, to find the geometry of it, to learn its current shape from the inside. He was listening, in the way Obi-Wan had always told him to listen. Obi-Wan's Soresu received every strike and gave nothing back. It was the form in its purest expression, refined beyond what Anakin had seen even in their most serious training exchanges. Deflecting at the minimum necessary angle, rotating the blade in tight circles that redirected force with the efficiency of physics rather than muscle, never moving his feet more than a centimeter when a centimeter was enough, never expending anything that the situation did not require. He was a wall, not a static wall, a breathing one, a wall that moved with the pressure, rather than against it, that found the line of least resistance in each attack, and used it to render the attack irrelevant. Anakin's power slid off him like water off ice. He pressed harder, changed angle, combined a high strike with a low force push that was not meant to move Obi-Wan but to change the acoustic texture of the ground between them, destabilizing the surface footing by a fraction of a centimeter, just enough to introduce a variable. Obi-Wan adjusted without visible effort. The parry came from a marginally different angle and landed in the same place. Anakin stepped back. He breathed. They circled. The cave system worked against clean positioning. The crystal formations that had survived the demolition teams jutted from walls and ceiling and floor in irregular clusters, creating corridors and alcoves that a fight kept trying to organize itself around whether the fighters wanted it to or not. Obi-Wan used this with the same passive precision he used everything, not actively maneuvering Anakin toward unfavorable positions, simply declining to move away from favorable ones, so that Anakin had to choose between the attack line he wanted and the terrain he needed. Anakin chose the terrain. He pulled the fight laterally, away from a narrowing in the cave floor where a demolished crystal formation had left rubble that would complicate his footwork. Obi-Wan declined to follow directly, moving instead along a parallel path that maintained their distance, while improving his own position. For 10 seconds they were not fighting, but navigating. Two men who had spent 20 years learning each other's instincts, using them to read the other's intention in real time. "The form you're using," Anakin said, still moving. His breathing was controlled, but audible. "That's still Soresu. It's still yours. You didn't give up who you are. A beat. You buried it." Obi-Wan's blade held its position exactly. "The defense is the same," he said. "What it defends has changed." "You're defending nothing," Anakin said. "That's the problem." Obi-Wan came forward. The strike he opened with was not Soresu. It was something else, the dark side version of what Obi-Wan had always done with the Force, as a supplement to his form. He had always been a master of environmental control, force push and displacement, and the management of space as a tactical resource. Now those abilities carried a different quality. He did not push. He pressed, slowly and with the particular force of something that does not hurry because it does not need to. Cold air advancing, and Anakin felt it against his blade arm first, a thickening, a resistance building from outside rather than from impact. His arm slowed. Not dramatically, centimeters per second, a degradation of movement that a less attentive fighter might not register until the blade was already in the wrong place. Anakin registered it immediately and pushed back with light side force in a focused burst through his sword arm, the warmth of it burning through the cold resistance, and the hold broke. He stepped into the released momentum and struck. Obi-Wan's parry came from the wrong angle for his Soresu. A half-second adjustment, a rotation of the wrist that was slightly less than perfectly economical. The blades locked for a moment, red against blue, held in contact, and the crystals in the surrounding walls produced an agonized composite sound, the bled crystal and the living ones screaming against each other at a frequency that ran from Anakin's blade hand up his arm and into his teeth. He breathed through it. He stayed present. The lock broke. Both men moved back. The ceiling cracked, not explosively, a deep, structural sound, the groan of rock under sustained force pressure from two extraordinarily powerful combatants operating at full capacity in a confined space. Ice that had been sealed to the stone above them for centuries shifted, and a section perhaps 2 meters across dropped 3 centimeters and held, fractured, sending a cascade of small ice crystals down through the cave air. A crystal formation on the east wall, already damaged from the demolition teams, sheared away from its base and collapsed into the rubble below, with a sound like a chord played on a broken instrument. Obi-Wan did not flinch. He moved through his own damage without acknowledgement, stepping around the fallen formation, his blade tracking Anakin's position with the patient continuity of a compass needle finding north. Anakin felt every broken crystal, not as pain exactly, as loss. Each one a small subtraction, a note going out of a chord, the force environment of the cave becoming fractionally thinner with each formation that fell. He had to breathe through each one deliberately, staying in contact with what remained rather than in grief for what was gone, staying present. The cave was distressed, and the distress was in him, and he could not allow it to become anger, because anger was what Obi-Wan would know how to handle. He began to move the fight, not retreating, redirecting. He changed the geometry of his attacks, pulling Obi-Wan's responses toward the cave's upper end, toward the passage that led back into the temple proper. He did it gradually, not so abruptly that it read as intent, using the terrain as justification. A column of crystal forcing him left, rubble forcing him right, each individual movement reasonable, the aggregate adding up to 15 meters of position over 2 minutes of fighting. Obi-Wan understood. He began to press back, declining to follow the cave's upper end, circling to maintain the confined space that his defense preferred. For a moment the fight was entirely about direction. Neither man swinging a blade, both using force and footwork, and the specific intelligence of people who had trained together for 20 years and knew exactly how the other would read a given movement. "You want the temple," Obi-Wan said. "I want room," Anakin said. "The cave is going to come down. The cave will hold. You've been blasting its foundations for 2 days. It won't hold through this." A pause in which neither of them moved. Both blades held ready, the cave producing its sustained, dissonant chorus around them. "You always argued about structural integrity," Obi-Wan said, and something in his voice shifted almost imperceptibly. A tone that lived just beneath the current one. A tone that was very old and very familiar, and had nothing to do with dark or light, and everything to do with two people who had spent a decade bickering about tactical decisions in circumstances where bickering was categorically inappropriate. Anakin pressed the opening. He moved fast, full gem-so, 3 strikes in sequence designed not to land but to move, to push Obi-Wan's response laterally, using the 3rd strike's deflection to redirect himself past the nearest crystal column and toward the passage. Obi-Wan pursued. his soresu shifting into something more active and less patient than its standard expression, and they went through the passage together, still fighting. The passage so narrow that for 4 strides they were essentially in each other's space, blades between them at almost no distance, both operating in the pure economy of forms stripped to their fundamentals. They burst through into the temple. The difference was immediate and total. The cave sound, the crystal resonance, the amplified harmonics, the accumulated acoustic signature of a space built from living, force-sensitive stone, replaced by the dead cold of ice-covered walls and frozen Jedi banners, and the particular silence of a place that had been abandoned for 6 months. The ceiling was high and vaulted, lost in shadows, and the echo was stone rather than crystal, every sound arriving back slightly delayed and slightly changed, the way voices sound in old buildings that have heard too much. Wind moved through a breach in the outer wall somewhere ahead of them. Not Ilum's full blizzard force, filtered through multiple chambers, but present, a cold current that found the gaps in their clothing and moved through them with the casual authority of something that didn't notice the difference between inside and outside. They separated to opposite sides of the chamber. Both were breathing harder. Obi-Wan's soresu was designed for endurance beyond almost any other form. It was meant to outlast, to remain functional past the point where any opponent's aggression had exhausted itself. But the force environment of the cave had been working on him in ways that endurance training didn't account for. The living crystal's influence reached through the temple's stone and ice, and they had been responding to Anakin since he arrived. The space itself had taken a position, was taking a position in the way of very old places that have accumulated enough force resonance to develop something that was not quite preference, but functioned like it. Obi-Wan felt it. Anakin watched him feel it, watched the slight adjustment in his stance as the temple's ambient force quality registered, something he had always done when entering a new space, the unconscious attunement of a man with 35 years of reading force environments behind him. "Even the temple stands with you," Obi-Wan said, almost to himself. Not accusation, observation delivered in the tone of a man noting an unexpected data point. "Not against you," Anakin said. "For you, there's a difference." Obi-Wan looked at him across the chamber. His yellow eyes and the pale light coming through the frosted windows were doing something complicated, not the simple predation of a Sith in combat, but the specific, fractured quality of a man who has been presented with a thing his current architecture has no category for. He raised his blade. Anakin raised his. They moved toward the breach in the outer wall, still fighting, and the blizzard's voice grew louder with every step, and ahead of them the temple opened into Ilum's exposed face. And the ice bridge was there, spanning the chasm, groaning under the weight of 6 months of accumulated ice, and the storm received them both without ceremony or preference, wrapping them in white. The bridge was 40 meters of glacial ice, spanning nothing. Below it, the chasm was deep enough that the blizzard filled it. Not the bottom, just blowing white, the darkness beginning somewhere beneath the white and continuing past any point that useful information could be gathered about it. The bridge itself was ancient, formed not by Jedi construction but by the slow, indifferent geology of a world that had been pressing ice against ice for 10,000 years. It curved slightly, the way things curve when they grow rather than when they are built, and its surface was wind-scoured to a smoothness that was identical to the surface of the chasm walls around it, which meant that at the edges there was no visual distinction between where the bridge ended and where it didn't. They fought onto it. The ice shuddered under the first exchange, not from the force of the blows, from the sustained resonance of 2 lightsabers at close range, in a space with nowhere for the harmonic to go except down into the structure, into the glacial compression that had held this formation together for a longer time than the Jedi Order had existed. Anakin felt it through his boots and adjusted his footwork, shifting to a narrower stance that reduced the lateral pressure of his strikes, sacrificing power for stability. Obi-Wan made no visible adjustment. His soresu thrived in confined space. The bridge's narrow width removed the primary advantage of Anakin's form, the wide driving strikes of Gem, so that used full reach and required full extension, and left him working in the compact, vertical range that soresu was designed to neutralize. He was fighting uphill in more than one sense, and they both knew it, and knowing it didn't change it. He pressed anyway. The bridge surface fractured in hairline patterns under their feet, individual cracks spreading laterally from each point of contact with the cold precision of things that had been waiting for an excuse. Anakin felt the structural integrity through the Force in the way he felt all physical environments, as texture rather than measurement, an impression of the load the ice was carrying and the distribution of where it wasn't. The bridge had been under stress before they arrived. The demolition work in the caves below had transmitted vibration up through the mountain face for 2 days. The glacial pressure from the chasm walls had been working on the span's anchoring points long before that. The bridge was not going to survive this fight in its current form. He filed the information without acting on it. Midway across, Obi-Wan had been absorbing. That was the only way to read it, the passive precision of his torso receiving every strike with minimum expenditure, building nothing, taking nothing, simply enduring, waiting with the patience of a man who had calculated the end of a sequence and was content to let the sequence arrive at its own pace. Anakin had been watching for it, the moment when the patient defense became something else, and he almost missed it because when it came it looked like nothing. A controlled, force-enhanced slide, not a leap, not a surge, a smooth lateral acceleration that used the ice surface to his advantage, that appeared for half a stride like a defensive repositioning, and arrived 2 meters further along the bridge before Anakin had fully registered the change in his position's geometry. Obi-Wan turned. He was at the far end of the bridge, the higher end, the mountainside, where the span met the cliff face at a point fractionally elevated above the temple end. Behind him, rock and ice. Above him, the mountain. The blizzard at his back pressed against him and broke around him and kept moving. Anakin was at the lower end. The temple breach opened behind him, the wind coming across the chasm at his left side, and 30 meters of ice between him and the man who had just spent half a minute arranging this. Obi-Wan lowered his blade slightly, not in submission, the way you lower a weapon when you are certain enough of the outcome that holding it at guard height is excess. "It's over, Anakin," he said, his voice carried across the distance and the wind with the particular carrying quality it had always had, the measured authority that in 20 years had talked people out of wars and into surrenders and through missions that had no good ending, the voice that had once, specifically, talked Anakin through a landing sequence on a ship with no wings, in a harbor with no clear surface, calmly, as though the outcome were not in question because Obi-Wan had decided it wasn't. "I have modeled every move you will make from this position, every counter, every response. I calculated this engagement the moment you set foot on Ilum. There is no path forward that does not end with you yielding." A pause. "Step back. Leave. I promise. I promise I will not follow." The word promise carried something that the rest of the sentence did not. Anakin stood at the low end of the bridge and felt the wind against his back, and felt the chasm below him, and felt the 30 meters of cracking ice between him and a man who had just told him the truth, had calculated this, had set this up, had been patient through the entire cave and the temple and the opening phases of the bridge fight, specifically to arrive here, with Anakin at the low end and nowhere good to go. He felt the impulse. It came the way it always came, fast, clean, physical preceding thought. The bridge was there, the elevated position was there, the target was there, and the gap between them was a thing that could simply be closed by moving across it very quickly with a blade. He felt his weight shift forward by a fraction of a centimeter, felt his back leg begin to load. He closed his eyes. One breath. He listened. Not to the tactical situation, not to Obi-Wan, not to the blizzard or the groaning ice or the crystals below him humming their distressed chord up through the mountain. He listened to the Force, the way Yoda had told him to listen 17 years ago in a training room when Anakin had been 9 years old and too impatient to wait for information, and Yoda had said listen first. Then, no, and Anakin had thought he understood and had not understood yet. He understood now. He saw it. 1 second of clarity, the move Obi-Wan had prepared for, the defensive position arranged to receive a leaping attack, the precise counter already formed and waiting at the end of the sequence like a conclusion at the end of a proof. Obi-Wan had not given him the high ground. He had offered it. The high ground was the trap. The leap was what he was waiting for. Anakin opened his eyes. He lowered his lightsaber. He raised his free hand, not toward Obi-Wan, toward the bridge. He reached into the Force and felt the structure of the ice beneath him. Not the surface, the interior. The network of fractures and pressure lines and glacial stress that 2 days of cave demolition and 20 minutes of lightsaber duel had opened through the span. He felt the load-bearing points, the places where the anchor ice met the cliff faces on either end, the specific geometry of how the bridge was still holding. He felt the cracks running through it, fine as hair, spreading laterally, already having conversations with each other that were going to end only one way. He asked them to finish the conversation now. The bridge broke. It did not crack and crumble. It cracked and fell. The entire span, simultaneously the anchor points on both ends releasing in the same instant. 40 meters of glacial ice dropping into the chasm below, with a sound that was less like breaking than like a very large, very final exhalation. The noise of it went through Anakin's chest and stayed there. They were both already falling before the sound reached its full volume, the blizzard rushing up around them as they dropped. The cold absolute and immediate and total. Anakin reached out with the Force in two directions, his own impact cushion spreading below him, decelerating his fall in the last 5 meters, so that he hit the deep snow at the chasm's edge rather than the rock beneath it. Hard, but survivable. A landing that drove his knees up and sent him rolling through the drift in a controlled tumble that ended with him face down and white and already pushing himself upright. Obi-Wan's impact cushion, thrown across the chasm in the same motion, a reflex so immediate that he had not consciously decided to do it before it was done. Reaching for his master through the Force the way he had been reaching for him for 6 months in a freighter common room, with his hand against cold transparent steel, the thread that he had never let go of, still there, still open. And this time it had a practical application, and the Force moved through it without resistance. He got to his feet. The blizzard had not paused. It had no interest in pauses. 6 meters away, Obi-Wan was rising from the snow. Slower, not injured. The cushion had caught him, but the surprise of it, the fact that the fall had been both unexpected and survived, had introduced a fraction of a second of processing that Anakin did not have because he had planned the fall and Obi-Wan had not. More significantly, his lightsaber was not in his hand. It was somewhere in the snow, extinguished by the impact, its blade dying when it hit the drift, its red glow gone. It was in there somewhere, invisible, a weapon buried in white. Obi-Wan looked at his empty hand. He looked at Anakin. "You dropped the bridge," he said. Anakin was breathing hard. His blade was still lit, the blue of it the only warm color in the entire landscape. He stood in the snow and the blizzard and the aftermath of 40 meters of ice falling and looked at his master. "You calculated every move I'd make," he said. "You forgot to calculate the one I wouldn't." Obi-Wan moved for his weapon, not toward Anakin, away, angling into the drift where the lightsaber had to be, his Force sense searching for the blade beneath the snow, and Anakin felt the search as a Force signature, the particular reaching quality of it, and moved to cut off the angle. What followed was not the duel that the cave had been. It had no form. Obi-Wan without his lightsaber was still extraordinarily dangerous. Force push in wide, sweeping arcs that Anakin deflected or stepped around. Environmental manipulation, chunks of ice from the chasm walls torn free and hurled with the cold precision that characterized everything Obi-Wan did, trajectory calculated before release. Anakin's blade caught most of them. The ones it didn't, he moved around. And the ones he couldn't fully avoid, he took on the shoulder or the side with the Force dampening he had been practicing for 6 months, because there was no other way to prepare for fighting the man who taught you everything. He kept himself between Obi-Wan and the place where the lightsaber had to be. The search in the snow was a competition of Force senses. Obi-Wan reaching for his blade, Anakin reaching for it too, both of them aware of the other's searching, both adjusting their physical positioning in response to what the search told them about where the weapon was. Then they both found it. The red glow was visible, barely, a circle of melted snow the size of a palm where the blade's residual heat was working through the drift. 3 meters to Obi-Wan's left, and 4 to Anakin's right. Both of them reached with the Force simultaneously, the competing intentions meeting at the blade's crystal matrix and producing a moment of contested stillness. Then Anakin went deeper, not pushing harder, not overpowering. He reached past the contest for the grip, past the mechanics of it, down to the crystal inside, the bled crystal, the tormented thing, the kyber that had been forced to the dark side and had been screaming in the caves since he arrived. He reached for it the way he had always reached for crystals, the specific attunement he had never been able to fully explain that had made him extraordinary at every aspect of lightsaber construction and maintenance. The gift that was just a version of the larger gift, which was the capacity to connect. The crystal felt him. It hesitated. A fraction of a second, a pause in the contest for the blade that had nothing to do with Force power and everything to do with something older than any technique. The kyber had been in pain for 6 months. It had been used for things crystals were not made for, and something was reaching for it now that felt like what it remembered from before, from the cave, from before the bleeding. Obi-Wan's grip faltered. One fraction of a second, one moment of resonance between an old crystal and a new intention. Anakin swept the blade. The Force caught it and spun it. Out and away, not toward either of them, but out over the chasm's edge, into the dark below, the red glow strobing as it turned end over end through the blizzard, growing smaller, descending, the red light shrinking to a point and then to nothing, and then to the sound of it striking rock far below, and then to silence, darkness, except for blue. Obi-Wan was on his knees, not because Anakin had put him there, because the loss of the blade and the crystal's response to Anakin's touch had done something to him that physical impact had not. The dark side calcification around the wound, around all the wounds, had sustained itself partly through the bled crystal's resonance. The crystal was gone, and the resonance had changed before it went. That moment of hesitation, that fraction of recognition, had sent something through the bond between master and blade that was not the dark side and was not its absence, but was the question that preceded either. He was on his knees in the snow of Ilum, with his hands open at his sides and his head slightly bowed, and the yellow still in his eyes, but the yellow doing something it had not done at any point in the preceding 6 months. It was dimming, faintly. At the edges where yellow met white, the quality of the color was changing the way the sky changes at the very furthest edge of dawn. Not light yet, not even the beginning of light, but the absence of the certainty of dark. From below, through the mountain, through the ice and the stone and the fractured caves, the living kyber crystals were humming. Not in distress, not in the pain shriek of the red blade's presence. Something lower and steadier and calmer than either. The same tone they had produced when Anakin first touched them. The tone of recognition. Anakin stood in the snow, with his blue blade lit, and looked at his master on his knees in front of him. He breathed. Obi-Wan did not move. He stayed on his knees in the snow, with his hands open at his sides, and his head at the slight angle of a man who has reached the end of a very long calculation and arrived at a result he has no argument against. The blizzard moved through him the way it moved through everything on Ilum's surface, without preference, without ceremony, treating the kneeling man and the standing ice and the dark chasm behind them with the same complete indifference. His black robes were torn at the shoulders. Ice crystals had formed along his collar and in his beard. He was bleeding from somewhere above his left eyebrow, a small cut, the kind you don't feel until afterward, and the blood had half frozen against his cheekbone. He looked, for the first time in 6 months, like a man who was cold. Darth Imperius had not been cold. Darth Imperius maintained a controlled internal temperature the way he maintained everything. Through discipline applied so consistently it stopped feeling like effort, and became simply the condition of existence. But Obi-Wan Kenobi, kneeling in the snow of Ilum, with his blade gone and the crystals below him humming something that resonated in his chest like a frequency he had forgotten he was built to receive, was cold. He could feel the temperature. He could feel the wind. He could feel the specific texture of the snow under his knees, the give of it, the way it compressed and then stopped compressing. He could feel things. That was, in its way, the most frightening development of the evening. Anakin stood 3 meters away with the blue blade lit and his breathing visible in the frozen air, and said nothing. He was not advancing, he was not positioning. He was simply present, the blue light moving slightly in the wind, waiting with a quality of patience that sat in the space where Anakin's impatience used to live, and was somehow more unsettling than the impatience had ever been. Obi-Wan raised his head. "End it," he said. His voice was steady. That was not the dark side. The steadiness was his, the real steadiness, the one underneath all the architecture, the voice he had used for 35 years, in rooms where steadiness was the only available mercy. Anakin did not move. "End it," Obi-Wan said again. The repetition was not desperation, it was instruction, the tone of a man providing guidance that is necessary and clear, and should not require explanation. "I know what I am. I know what I've done." He paused. When he spoke again, the steadiness remained, but something was moving beneath it, the way water moves beneath ice, perceptible through the surface even when the surface holds. "Every face, Anakin. I see every face. I told myself it was for the greater peace. I told myself it was for you." Another pause, longer. but I see every face." The blizzard moved between them. "This is the Jedi way," Obi-Wan said. "This is what the code is for, to make death clean when it must happen. Make it clean." Anakin looked at him for a long time. The blue blade hummed in the wind. From below, the faint, sustained tone of the living crystals. The cold pressed in from every direction with the flat consistency of a world that had been cold since before anyone arrived on it, and would be cold long after everyone left. "I'm not going to kill you," Anakin said. It was not said gently. It was not said harshly. It was said the way you say something that is simply true, and does not require the accompaniment of tone. Something cracked in Obi-Wan's voice. Just a fraction, a hairline fracture in the steadiness, the first since the temple, the first in 6 months. "Anakin, the Jedi way." Anakin's voice was quiet and did not waver. "You want to quote me the Jedi way, the code." He stopped. He looked at Obi-Wan in the snow, kneeling, bleeding, ice-covered, and his voice when he continued was not angry. It was something older than angry, something that had been through anger and come out the other side, and found something more durable waiting there. The code said don't love people. The code said don't grieve. The code said the right thing was to not feel, and look where the code got us. He took a step forward, not an attack, a step, the step of a man crossing a room towards someone, which was a different thing entirely, and which Obi-Wan's body registered as different before his mind had processed it. A slight tension, not the tension of defense, but the tension of something that didn't have a name in any combat training he had ever received. Anakin clipped the blue blade to his belt. The light died. They were in the blizzard dark. Not total, the pale white of the storm providing its own illumination, enough to see by, enough to see each other. Enough to see Obi-Wan's face in the moment the blue blade went out, and left only snowlight and the fading yellow of eyes that were already doing something at their edges. He took another step. Obi-Wan flinched, the most controlled man Anakin had ever known, the man who had walked into the temple weeping without missing a Soresu parry, the man who had accepted a Sith title without changing his posture, the man who had fought a duel on a collapsing bridge without once losing his cadence, flinched, not from the blade was gone. From the approach, from the openness of it, the complete absence of tactical framing. There was nothing to read in Anakin's movement except the movement itself, and it had no combat language in it at all. And Obi-Wan had no response trained for an approach that meant nothing except approach. "Don't," he said. His voice had changed. The instruction quality was gone. What was left was thinner, older, the voice underneath the voice that the voice had been protecting for a very long time. "Don't do whatever you're doing. I don't deserve." "I know," Anakin said. He was close now. He stopped at arm's reach. "I know you don't. Neither did I." He held Obi-Wan's eyes. The dimming yellow, the thing at their edges that was not yet blue but was no longer entirely certain of its own color. "You did it anyway. Every time I didn't deserve it. You came back. Every time. Every battle. Every mistake. Every time I did something that should have finished us. You came back." He paused. "I'm coming back." Obi-Wan's hands were still open at his sides. He had not raised them, had not moved to stand, had not done anything except look at Anakin with the expression of a man who has been handed something he has no category for, and is trying to determine whether he is allowed to hold it. Anakin knelt, not above him. At the same level, in the snow, at arm's reach, which was a choice that removed the last available geometry of hierarchy between them, and left only two people in a blizzard at the same height, the same cold, the same distance from the ground. He reached forward and put his arms around Obi-Wan, not carefully, not tentatively, the way you hold someone who has fallen from somewhere very high, the way you hold someone whose bones might be held together by the holding, who might come apart if the pressure is wrong, but who will certainly come apart if there is no pressure at all. Firm, specific. Not the embrace of performance or comfort, but the embrace of structural necessity, the kind that says, "I have you in the only language that bypasses all other languages." Obi-Wan went rigid. Every layer of it, the dark side, the discipline, the 20 years of performed serenity, the code's prohibition on exactly this, the muscle memory of a man who had not been held since Satine, who had not allowed himself to be held, who had built his entire architecture around the premise that he did not need to be held because needing to be held was a vulnerability, and vulnerability was what had gotten everyone he loved killed. All of it said, push back, Fight, maintain the wall. The wall had been standing since he was a Padawan, since Qui-Gon died on a reactor floor, since he held the body and the body was still warm, and someone had already handed him a new assignment, and he had taken it because taking it was what you did. Because the code was the structure, and the structure was what held you up when everything else fell. He could feel Anakin's heartbeat through his chest, the warmth of him, specific and immediate and all that cold, the warmth of a living person making contact with another living person in the oldest possible way, the way that predated language and training and doctrine and every system ever devised for managing the fact of human beings needing each other. "I am a Jedi," Anakin said very quietly, against his shoulder, "and I love you." The wall did not slowly lower. It fell. Not metaphorically. It fell the way the bridge had fallen. Total, simultaneous, every load-bearing point releasing in the same instant. The structure that had held for 20 years, discovering that it was gone before any individual part of it had finished the process of going. Obi-Wan Kenobi's composure, the composure that had survived Qui-Gon's death, and Satine's death, and the Clone Wars and the Temple and 6 months of being Darth Imperious, broke on the ice of Ilum in the arms of his student. Completely. Without remainder. He did not cry elegantly. There was nothing elegant about it. It was the sound of 20 years of sealed vaults opening simultaneously, of grief that had been compressed to the density of something structural finally being given permission to be grief again. And grief at that density did not emerge gracefully. It came out ragged and huge, and entirely without the dignity that Obi-Wan Kenobi had maintained as a point of personal honor since he was a Padawan and had decided that composure was the one gift he could always give to whatever situation required. The composure was gone. What was left was a man. Just a man. Cold, broken, guilty, exhausted down to something below the bone, and being held. Anakin held him. He did not speak. He did not move. He stayed in the snow and held his master while the blizzard continued its absolute indifference around them, and the crystals below hummed their recognition, and Obi-Wan broke with sound into the shoulder of the person who had come to find him. And Anakin did not flinch from any of it. Not the sound, not the weight of it, not the duration which was longer than either of them could have measured. He held on. When it passed, and it took a long time to pass, the kind of grief that has been waiting 20 years not concluding quickly, Obi-Wan pulled back. Not far. Enough to see. He looked at Anakin's face, and Anakin let himself be looked at, and for a moment neither of them said anything because nothing was needed yet. Then Anakin looked at his eyes. The yellow was going slowly, not the instant reversal of a dramatic restoration, but the genuine, gradual process of something finding its way back to where it belonged, from a very long distance away. The yellow receding like a tide, discovering that the force that had been driving it had exhausted itself, exposing what had been underneath it all along. Gray first, at the edges. Then, in the center, very slowly, the color of a winter sky beginning to decide it might consider blue. Obi-Wan's eyes, still full of everything that had happened, still carrying every face, but his. "Oh, Anakin," he said, barely above a whisper. His voice was completely wrecked and entirely present and more recognizable than it had been at any point in the preceding 6 months. "What have I done?" Not a question. The knowledge was already there, fully formed, waiting on the other side of the composure-like furniture, waiting in a room that has finally had its lights turned on. He knew. He had always known. The dark side's primary architecture was not ignorance. It was a system for making knowledge unactionable, for sealing information behind reasoning that felt correct and was not. Now the reasoning was gone, and the knowledge was just knowledge, open in the cold, unmediated. "Something terrible," Anakin said. "Simple, not cruel. True. And you're going to spend the rest of your life making it right." He held Obi-Wan's eyes. "But you don't have to do that from inside the Empire." Obi-Wan looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that was not a single emotion, but the beginning of the process of having emotions again. The reorientation of a system that had been running on the wrong fuel for 6 months and was now being asked to remember how it was originally designed to work. It would take time. It was going to take a great deal of time. "The Imperial unit," he said. His voice was steadier now, not the enforced steadiness of Darth Imperious, but the real one, the bedrock version, the steadiness that had always been underneath everything and that was, it turned out, still there, still his, the one I sent ahead of me to begin the second phase of the demolition. They'll be at the secondary access point, They'll report my silence within the hour. I know. Palpatine will know something happened before morning. I know. My ship is on the northern shelf, equipped with Imperial codes. If we move in the next 40 minutes, we can reach the outer system before. He stopped. He looked at Anakin. Something crossed his face that was complicated and old, and almost in the way of things that had been impossible for a very long time, suddenly becoming possible, amused. You already know all of this. I have a ship, Anakin said. Yoda's coordinates. Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment. Yoda, he said. The name did something to his face. The knowledge, again, open, unmediated, the full weight of what Yoda's survival meant and what his own role in the world that necessitated that survival had been. He's waiting, Anakin said. He's been waiting. He knew you'd come back. He couldn't have known that. He said the same thing he always says. Anakin stood. He offered his hand, not his prosthetic hand, his left, the one that was warm. He said the Force makes no promises, but it tends. Obi-Wan looked at the offered hand. He took it. Anakin pulled him to his feet, and they stood in the snow at the same height again, the chasm behind them, and the mountain ahead of them, and the blizzard doing what blizzards do. And for a moment, they were simply two men standing in an extraordinary amount of cold, which after everything that had preceded it, felt almost ordinary. And ordinary felt, after everything, like a remarkable thing to feel. Obi-Wan looked at the mountain, at the temple above, at what he had come here to do, and had not finished, and would not finish. We need to move, he said. The dry precision was back in his voice, faint but present, like an instrument found after a long time in a case, a little stiff, a little out of tune, but recognizably itself, recognizably his. Anakin looked at him sideways. Your tactical genius is already back, he said, comforting. Something happened in Obi-Wan's face that was very small and very real, and sounded briefly like the ghost of a laugh that had forgotten how to be a laugh and was practicing in private before committing to it fully. Rusty, short, gone almost before it arrived. But there, they turned from the chasm and walked back through the snow toward the sheltered landing zone. Two sets of footprints pressing into the white, the blizzard beginning. Very gradually, in the way of things on Ilum that changed slowly if they changed at all, to ease. Below them, in the caves, the crystals hummed. Not the wrong pitch, not the off-frequency tone that had been sounding since the night in Palpatine's office, the Kyber dissonance that had followed this story like a signature of something broken. The right pitch this time, low and sustained and warm in the way that only living things are warm, settled into its natural frequency, the frequency it had been built to produce, the sound of something that has been in pain remembering what it was like before the pain. The crystals hummed, and the two men walked through the easing blizzard, and Ilum held them both. The camp stove was an absurdity. It was a standard-issue field unit from Anakin's ship, dull, gray, utilitarian, designed for soldiers eating in the field under circumstances that were generally not conducive to aesthetic consideration. It sat on the floor of the Jedi Temple's main chamber, which had stood for 4,000 years, which had floors of hand-laid stone, worn smooth by the feet of generations of initiates and masters, and the small, careful steps of children finding their crystals for the first time, and it produced a low blue flame that was entirely indifferent to the significance of its surroundings. Both men held their hands over it. The warmth was real and immediate, and asked nothing of them, which was what warmth was for. The temple breathed cold around them, the wind through the outer breach, the ice on the walls, the ancient dark above them, where the ceiling vaults had been accumulating Ilum's particular variety of silence for longer than either of them had been alive. The frozen Jedi banners hung in the dim like the flags of a country neither of them belonged to anymore, in exactly the way they once had. The damage from the demolition teams was visible in the outer sections. Raw edges where stone had been blasted, gaps in the architecture that the temple had not been designed to have. Obi-Wan looked at it. He looked at all of it, slowly, without flinching. I ordered the caves destroyed, he said. Some of the formations are gone. Not all of them, Anakin said. The deep formations, the ones closest to the planet's core, we didn't get that far. The heart of it is still intact. Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment. That was not my efficiency, he said. That was you arriving before we finished. Lucky timing. The Force has better timing than luck. He looked at the flame. But you knew that. He went through it methodically. That was the thing about Obi-Wan. Even here, even now, even with 20 years of sealed grief newly broken open, and his eyes still adjusting to their own color, the structure of how he processed things was his own. It had always been his own. The code had used it. The dark side had used it. Neither of them had created it. He laid it out in the same flat, precise voice he had used to brief generals and debrief councils and report casualties to people who needed to know the number rather than the name, the temple, the Jedi he had killed, the ones he had captured and sent to facilities he knew the locations of and could now disclose, the intelligence networks he had compromised, the systems he had helped Palpatine seal, the specific shape of what the Empire looked like from the inside of the room where it was being built. Anakin listened to all of it without interrupting. When Obi-Wan finished, he was still holding his hands over the stove. He looked at them, his hands, both of them, familiar and unchanged, which was its own kind of strange. The hands that had done what they had done, looking exactly as they had always looked. "You can't undo it," he said. "None of it. I know that. I am not asking for absolution. I'm not offering it," Anakin said. "That's not mine to give. What I'm offering is a choice about what happens next." Obi-Wan looked at him. Anakin met the look steadily. The blue eyes, his eyes again, still raw at the edges, still carrying everything they were going to carry for a long time, looked back at him and did not look away. "Come back," Anakin said, simply without architecture around it. "To us, to Yoda, to whatever the rebellion is becoming. You know things we need to know. And beyond what you know," he stopped, started more carefully. "You belong with us. That's separate from useful. That's just true." Obi-Wan was quiet for a long moment. "A man who has done what I have done cannot walk into a rebellion and be trusted," he said finally. Not bitterly, with the same precision he brought to everything. "I understand that. More importantly, I understand that being trusted again would require me to be absolved, and I cannot allow myself to be absolved. The weight of this has to stay. It's the only thing that will ensure I never." He stopped. Something moved across his face. "That I don't." He stopped again. The silence lasted a breath. "It's okay to feel it," Anakin said, very gently. Obi-Wan looked at him. Something in the look acknowledged what the sentence was doing. Its simplicity, its directness, the complete absence of Jedi doctrine in it. Just permission. Just a person telling another person that the feeling was allowed to be there. "Yes," he said. "I know." A pause. "I'm learning." Another pause, shorter. "I'm very new at learning that." The stove burned between them. Outside, the blizzard had dropped to something quieter, still cold, still Ilum, but no longer the wall of white it had been. Through the outer breach, visible in the dark, the first suggestion of the planet's auroras, blue-green at the horizon, beginning their slow movement across the sky. Obi-Wan reached into his robes. What he produced was small, a data chip, military grade, Imperial encryption, the kind of thing that looked like nothing and contained everything. He held it between two fingers and set it on the stone between them, with the specific deliberateness of someone placing something down, rather than handing it, which was its own kind of statement. "Palpatine's private Imperial command codes," he said, "not the public ones. The ones that override regional governors, clone martial commanders, automated weapons platforms, and the Senate subcommittee intelligence databases. He rotates them every 72 hours. These are current as of 12 hours ago. They will remain valid for 60 more." Anakin looked at the chip. He did not pick it up yet. "Also," Obi-Wan continued, in the tone of a man reading from an internal list he has been maintaining for some time, "complete troop deployments across 7 sectors, including the location of every active Imperial black site I know of, which is most of them. Hyperspace route maps for Palpatine's personal courier network, and the location of a secondary Imperial communications hub on Scarif that, if destroyed, would render Imperial High Command communications partially blind for approximately 4 weeks." The temple held the silence for a moment. "You had this ready," Anakin said. "I prepared it 6 months ago," Obi-Wan said, "in case you came." Anakin looked at him. "You hoped I'd come." Obi-Wan looked back. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Very small, very real. The ghost of an expression that had lived in that precise location for 35 years, and had been absent for 6 months, and was finding its way back to where it belonged, with the careful uncertainty of something that is not yet sure it will be permitted to stay. "I counted on it," he said. "Some things don't change." He told Anakin where he was going while they packed the stove back into the ship's supply case. Not a specific world. He had no world in mind, no coordinates prepared, no infrastructure waiting. The unknown regions, the edges of the charted galaxy, whatever was there, he would find it when he arrived. He had always been good at finding what was there when he arrived, even when what was there was not what he had been expecting. He would spend whatever time he had doing something small, something direct, something that could not be confused with governance or strategy or the management of systems, which he had decided he was no longer permitted to manage on any scale above the immediate and the human. He did not know what that looked like yet. He would find out. Yoda won't like this, Anakin said. Yoda will understand completely and dislike it intensely, Obi-Wan said. The two are not mutually exclusive. I've known him a long time. Anakin looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up the supply case and carried it out through the temple breach and into the cold. The blizzard had become a clear, cold darkness. Above them, above the mountain, above Ilum's perpetual cloud cover that had parted for reasons of its own. Because Ilum did what Ilum did without consulting the preferences of anyone on its surface. The auroras were out. Sheets of blue-green light moving slowly across the black, rippling at their edges with the particular quality of things that are both enormous and quiet, that cover vast distances and make no sound doing it. The stars were visible between the aurora sheets, sharp and close, the way stars were only on worlds with no atmosphere worth speaking of. They stood at the base of Anakin's ship. The kyber crystals below them, in the surviving formations of the deep caves, were humming their natural tone up through the mountain and the ice and the stone of the landing shelf, faint and sustained and correct. The right pitch, not the dissonance that had been sounding since the night in Palpatine's office, not the pain shriek of the bled crystal, not the off-frequency signal that had been running through this story like a wound looking for a name. Just the tone the crystals had been producing before any of this began, the tone they would produce long after, the sound of living things doing what they were made to do. Obi-Wan looked up at the auroras. Anakin watched him look. "You were always better than I told you," Obi-Wan said. He was still looking at the sky. His voice was quiet and without any of the deliberateness of prepared speech. The words had simply arrived, and he was allowing them to leave, which was a thing he was learning to do. "You told me enough," Anakin said. Obi-Wan looked at him then. The full look, unguarded, the one that had been behind the professional warmth for 20 years, behind the negotiator's composure and the master's authority and every mask that the role had required, and that he had worn until he forgot he was wearing them. The look underneath all of it, just a man, looking at someone he loved. "I didn't tell you that I was proud of you," he said, specifically and continuously, for all of it. He paused. Even, perhaps especially, this. Anakin held the look. He did not deflect from it, and he did not perform anything in response to it. He let it land in the place it was aimed at, which was the place that had been waiting for it since he was 9 years old on a ship leaving Tatooine, trying to understand what it meant that someone he had just met believed in him before he had given them any particular reason to. "I know," Anakin said. "I always knew. That was enough, too." Obi-Wan put his hand on Anakin's shoulder, the gesture that had passed between them 100 times across 20 years, in briefing rooms and on battlefields and in temple corridors, after difficult sessions and at the end of missions that had gone badly, and at the beginning of ones that might, settled into its familiar place with the ease of something that had never stopped belonging there. It stayed for 3 seconds, which was the same 3 seconds it had always been, the amount of time that was always sufficient, because they had always understood each other without requiring more. Then Obi-Wan released it. He turned. He walked across the ice toward the Imperial shuttle he had arrived in, his footsteps precise and unhurried. The walk that was his, and had always been his, that no amount of dark side or Sith title or Imperial architecture had changed by a single degree. The walk of a man going somewhere with a specific intention and enough patience to arrive at the pace that the situation required. Anakin stood still and watched him go. The shuttle's engines were a distant sound, and then no sound, and Ilum held its cold around the absence, and Anakin stood alone under the auroras for a while before he went inside. What happened after that took years, and was not simple, and did not resolve cleanly, because things that are worth resolving rarely do. He gave Bail Organa the chip 2 days later, in a meeting that lasted 4 minutes, because the chip said everything that needed saying, and both of them were people who understood when talking was finished. They hit the Scarif communications hub 16 days after that. Palpatine was blind in 3 sectors for exactly 26 days, not 4 weeks. The math was off by 2 days, but they made it count in ways that Obi-Wan, calculating alone on a ship headed for the edge of the galaxy, had not been able to fully anticipate because he had not known what Anakin and Yoda and Bail Organa and Mon Mothma and a collection of clone commanders who had been quietly deciding things for months would do with 60 hours of access to Imperial override codes. The battle that followed was another story. What mattered was that Palpatine did not see it coming, because the man who had known Palpatine better than anyone was no longer telling him what to expect. Padmé gave a speech later when there was a Senate again to give it to. She stood in the chamber she had served in for 8 years and said that democracy was not the absence of conflict, that it was the agreement to keep talking. She looked at Anakin when she said it, and he thought of Obi-Wan, and the thinking did not hurt in the way it once had. It carried grief and gratitude in equal measure, which was, he had come to understand, exactly what love cost and exactly what it was worth. On a world in the unknown regions whose name does not appear in any Imperial database, because the Empire had not gotten that far yet, the dawn came slowly. It came the way dawns came on cold, quiet worlds, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a gradual revision of the sky from one quality of dark to another, the stars fading not by disappearing, but by becoming less urgent, the horizon finding its own color in degrees too small to track individually, but that added up, over time, to morning. Obi-Wan Kenobi sat in gray robes on a flat rock outside a shelter he had built himself from materials the world provided, which had taken him 4 days and turned out adequately. No weapon within reach. His hands rested open on his knees, in the meditation posture he had first learned at 4 years old in the temple creche, and had practiced every day since, with varying degrees of sincerity, and was now practicing, for the first time in his life, without any objective beyond the practice itself. His face was still scarred. There were lines there now that hadn't been there before, not age lines, different ones, the kind that come from specific events rather than accumulated time. They would be there for the rest of his life, which was correct. Some things should remain visible, some things should not be allowed to heal to invisibility. His eyes were closed. The dawn moved against his face. He felt it, the specific warmth of a new sun finding exposed skin, the way cold air begins to shift when something larger than it asserts a different temperature. He felt the living force of the world around him, different from Coruscant, different from Ilum, different from every world he had catalogued over 35 years of movement. Its own frequency, its own particular quality of aliveness, neither more nor less than any other world's, simply itself. He was learning it. Something approached him, small. He felt its force presence before he heard it, the uncomplicated presence of a creature that had not yet developed reasons to be suspicious of things it hadn't met before. A light footfall, a pause, the quality of attention that small animals give to unfamiliar objects before deciding what category to put them in. He opened his eyes. It looked back at him from a meter away, small, furred, entirely unimpressed by his history. "I know," Obi-Wan said quietly. "Don't mind me." He held its gaze with the full, unhurried attention he was learning to give to things that were simply in front of him. "I'm new here." The creature considered this. The morning settled around them both. Yoda told him once that attachment was the shadow of grief. That when you love something, you are already grieving it. He used to think that was the saddest thing he had ever heard. This ancient knowing being, 900 years of accumulated experience distilled into a single observation about loss. He used to sit with that sentence and feel the weight of it pressing down. Now he thought it might be the most honest thing he had ever been told. He loved Obi-Wan Kenobi. He was grieving Obi-Wan Kenobi, the version of him that was gone, the years that were gone, the path not taken. The man who had been sealed inside his own composure for so long that the composure had become indistinguishable from the man, until a blizzard and a broken bridge, and an embrace in the snow had demonstrated finally that they were different things. He grieved that, he would always grieve that, and he was grateful. Every day. That somewhere in the dark, in gray robes on a rock, on a world without a recorded name, Obi-Wan Kenobi was sitting in the morning and allowing himself to feel it. Learning to feel it. New at it still, in the way of someone who has lived their whole life in one language and is now learning the grammar of another, slowly with effort, making mistakes, getting better. That was what peace looked like. Not a galaxy that never cracked. A person who had cracked, who knew they had cracked, who had chosen to stay inside the life that remained on the other side of the cracking and do something with it. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. I love you, Master. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.